Hey friends, welcome to the Horror Sleep. Almost 90% of you watching aren't subscribed. If you enjoy these true park ranger horror stories, hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps the channel. Oh, and where are you watching from tonight? Let me know in the comments. I am Caleb Dernis, and for most of the last 11 years, I have worked as a wilderness ranger for the Bureau of Land Management in the Hells Canyon National Recreation Area. Located right along the Idaho-Oregon border, if you don't know where Hells Canyon is, let me tell you this. It is the deepest river gorge in North America, carved out over millions of years by the Snake River. The sides tower above a mile in some places. Trust me when I tell you this place is remote, this place is brutal. And during those years in this canyon, I saw things which led me to question if I truly understood the wilderness. I'm not talking about Bigfoot or UFOs or any of that nonsense. What I'm talking about is the kind of thing that happens when you're miles from civilization. When the sun goes down and the canyon walls trap the darkness like water in a bowl. When you realize that all your training and all your equipment mean absolutely nothing if the wilderness decides it doesn't want you there. This story takes place in late September of 2009. I'd been with the BLM for about 6 years at that point, long enough to know the terrain, but not so long that I'd gotten complacent. That's important because what happened that week still makes me wonder if I'd somehow missed warning signs that a more experienced ranger might have caught. The Hells Canyon area is popular with a certain type of visitor, people who want real wilderness, not the sanitized national park experience. We're talking serious backpackers, experienced river runners, hunters who know how to handle themselves in rough country. These aren't tourists who show up in flip-flops asking where the Wi-Fi is. So when someone goes missing in Hells Canyon, it's rarely because they made some stupid rookie mistake. That's what made the Dana Whitlock case so unusual from the start. I got the call on a Thursday afternoon. I was at the Pittsburgh Landing Ranger Station, which is basically a glorified shed with a dock on the Snake River, doing paperwork and trying not to fall asleep in the late summer heat. My supervisor, a grizzled old guy named Frank Reardon, radioed me from the Riggins office. "Caleb, we've got a possible missing person situation. Female hiker, 43 years old, name's Dana Whitlock. She was supposed to check in with her sister 3 days ago and never made the call. Sister's worried enough to contact us." I grabbed my notepad. Where was she hiking? That's the thing. According to her itinerary, she was doing a solo trip along the Dry Creek Trail, planning to camp near the river for a few nights. She's an experienced hiker, done this route before, but she's 3 days overdue and not answering her satellite phone. The Dry Creek Trail isn't technically in my usual patrol area, but with our limited staff, rangers in Hells Canyon end up covering a lot of ground. Frank asked if I could head out that afternoon to check her planned camping spots. It was already past 3 o'clock, which meant I'd be hiking in the dark, but that wasn't anything unusual. I packed my gear, GPS, first aid kit, emergency supplies, headlamp, radio, sidearm, standard search and rescue loadout. I also grabbed the SAT phone, even though reception in the canyon can be spotty at best. Then I loaded everything into my truck and headed south along the river road. The thing about Hells Canyon that most people don't appreciate until they're actually there is how isolated it feels. This isn't like hiking in Yellowstone or the Smokies where you're never more than a few miles from a paved road. In Hells Canyon, you can hike for 3 days without seeing another human being. Cell service doesn't exist. Regular radio can be hit or miss depending on where you are in the canyon. If something goes wrong, you're on your own. I reached the Dry Creek trailhead around 4:30. The parking area was empty except for a silver Toyota RAV4 with Washington plates, which matched the vehicle description Frank had given me for Dana Whitlock. That was good news and bad news. Good because it confirmed she'd made it to the trailhead. Bad because it meant she was definitely still out there somewhere. I checked the vehicle. Nothing unusual. No signs of forced entry, no blood, no indication of any kind of struggle. I snapped a few photos with my camera for the report, then shouldered my pack and started up the trail. Dry Creek Trail is a challenging hike even in good conditions. It starts with a brutal 1,000-foot climb out of the canyon, then levels off into a series of ridges and valleys before dropping back down to the Snake River. The terrain is a mix of rocky outcroppings, sagebrush, and scattered stands of ponderosa pine. In September, the rattlesnakes are still active, and you've got to watch every step. I made good time on the initial climb. The sun was starting to sink toward the western rim of the canyon, throwing long shadows across the trail. I kept my eyes open for any sign of Dana. Footprints, disturbed vegetation, maybe some gear she'd dropped. Nothing. About 2 hours in, I reached the first spot on her itinerary where she'd planned to camp. It was a flat area about 50 yards off the main trail, overlooking a tributary creek. I could see why she'd chosen it. Good water source, relatively level ground, decent tree cover for shade. But there was no sign she'd ever been there. No fire ring, no tent stakes in the ground. Not even a single footprint in the soft dirt near the creek. I spent 20 minutes searching the area just to be sure, then marked the location on my GPS and moved on. By the time I reached the second potential camping spot, it was almost dark. This one was closer to the main river tucked into a small box canyon where Dry Creek met the Snake. The sound of moving water echoed off the rock walls, creating this strange, amplified effect that made it hard to judge distances. I switched on my headlamp and started scanning the area. That's when I saw the tent. It was set up properly, guy lines tight, rainfly secure. A green, two-person tent, probably a north face or something similar, positioned on a flat spot about 30 feet from the river's edge. The sight of it sent a spike of adrenaline through my system. This was either very good news, I'd found Dana and she was fine, or very bad news. "Hello?" I called out. "Dana Whitlock, this is Ranger Dernis with the Bureau of Land Management. I'm here to check on your welfare." No response. Just the sound of the river, that weird amplified rushing noise bouncing off the canyon walls. I approached the tent slowly, hand near my sidearm. You never know what you're walking into in situations like this. People can be unpredictable, especially if they're injured or in distress. "Dana, I'm going to approach your tent now. I'm a federal ranger, and I'm here to help." Still nothing. I knelt down next to the tent and unzipped the fly. My headlamp beam cut through the darkness inside, and what I saw made absolutely no sense. The tent was empty. Not just empty, pristine. The sleeping bag was laid out perfectly, still in its stuff sack. A small backpack sat in one corner, unopened. A water bottle stood upright next to a rolled-up sleeping pad. Everything was organized, clean, completely untouched. But here's the thing that immediately struck me as wrong. The inside of the tent was completely dry. I'm talking bone dry, not a trace of moisture anywhere. But the outside of the tent, including the floor that I could see from the inside, was soaking wet. Not just damp from evening dew, I'm talking water saturated, like someone had just pulled it out of the river. I backed out of the tent and stood up, shining my light around the campsite. The ground around the tent was wet too, but only in a perfect circle maybe 10 feet in diameter. Beyond that circle, the dirt was dry, cracked from the summer heat. That's when I noticed the footprints. They led away from the tent toward the river. Bare feet, human, probably a woman's based on the size. The prints were pressed deep into the wet dirt, as if whoever made them had been carrying a heavy load or moving very slowly. But here's what made my skin crawl. The direction. The footprints led toward the river, not away from it, and they pointed upstream. Now, I don't know if you've ever been around a major river, but there are rules. Water flows downhill, always. The Snake River runs north through Hell's Canyon, which means downstream is north, upstream is south. These footprints were pointing south toward the sound of rushing water, but the sound was coming from behind me, from the north, downstream. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, trying to make sense of what I was seeing and hearing. The rational part of my brain was already working through explanations. Acoustic anomaly, echo effect, maybe I was just disoriented in the dark. But my gut was screaming that something was very, very wrong. I followed the footprints. They led down to the river's edge, clear as day in my headlamp beam, each toe and heel perfectly defined in the wet mud. And then they just stopped. Right at the waterline, they ended. No signs of someone wading into the river, no drag marks, nothing. Just 14 bare footprints leading to the Snake River and then nothing. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Ranger Dernis, over." Static. I tried again. Nothing. The canyon walls were blocking the signal. I pulled out the SAT phone and tried calling Frank's office. It rang twice, then cut to a strange tone I'd never heard before. Not a busy signal, not a no service indicator, just this flat, continuous tone like someone had left a phone off the hook. The sound of the river was getting louder. I could hear it clearly now, that deep, rushing roar of moving water, and it was definitely coming from the wrong direction. I turned around, shining my light upstream, toward the south, but I couldn't see the river itself from where I was standing. The beam just disappeared into darkness. I made a decision. I was going back to the tent to gather Dana's gear, document everything with photos, and then hike back to my truck. This was beyond a simple welfare check now. We needed a full search and rescue team, maybe even a helicopter if we could get one into the canyon. But when I turned back toward the campsite, my headlamp beam caught something that stopped me cold. The tent was gone. I stood there, my light sweeping across the spot where I'd just been standing maybe 2 minutes ago. The ground was there, the trees were there, but the tent had vanished. No sign it had ever existed. No guy line marks in the dirt, no compressed grass where it had been set up, nothing. And the ground was dry again, completely dry, as if it hadn't been wet in weeks. The river sound was directly behind me now, so close I could feel the spray on my neck, but when I spun around there was nothing but empty darkness where the water should have been. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I ran back toward the main trail as fast as I could in the dark, stumbling over rocks, branches whipping across my face. My headlamp beam bounced wildly, and twice I nearly went down, but I kept moving. The sound followed me. That deep, rushing roar stayed right on my heels, never getting closer, never getting farther away. And underneath it, I could hear something else. A voice, maybe. Or voices. Calling out words I couldn't quite make out. Syllables that rose and fell with the rhythm of the current. I don't remember much of the hike back to the trailhead. I remember my lungs burning, my legs screaming. I remember the beam of my headlamp catching glimpses of the trail markers, the only proof I was going the right direction. And I remember that sound, that impossible river sound, following me every step of the way until I finally broke out of the trees and saw my truck sitting there in the parking lot, solid and real and normal. The RAV4 was gone. Dana Whitlock's vehicle, which had been parked right next to mine just a few hours ago, was nowhere to be seen. I checked my watch. It was 11:47 p.m. I'd been in the canyon for just over 6 hours. I sat in my truck with the engine running and the doors locked until sunrise. The river sound faded around 2 a.m., diminishing gradually until all I could hear were the normal nighttime noises: insects, wind, the distant call of an owl. By the time the sun came up, I'd almost convinced myself I'd experienced some kind of altitude-related hallucination, maybe a panic attack brought on by stress and exhaustion. But I couldn't explain the missing tent. I couldn't explain the footprints leading into the river, and I definitely couldn't explain why Dana Whitlock's vehicle had vanished from the parking area. When I finally got radio contact with Frank around 7 a.m., I gave him a carefully edited version of what had happened. I told him I'd found a campsite that appeared to belong to Dana, that there were signs she'd gone into the river, and that her vehicle was no longer at the trailhead. I didn't mention the wet tent or the backward river sound or any of the other impossible details. Frank was quiet for a long moment after I finished. Then he said, "Caleb, I need you to come back to the office. Don't go back into that canyon. We're calling in a full SAR team." "Copy that," I said. "What about the vehicle?" Another pause. "What vehicle?" "Dana Whitlock's RAV4. It was here when I arrived yesterday, but it's gone now." "Caleb." Frank's voice had taken on a tone I'd never heard from him before. Careful, almost gentle. "Dana Whitlock doesn't own a RAV4. According to her sister, she drives a Subaru Outback. And that Subaru is currently parked at her apartment in Seattle. She never left." I looked at the empty parking area, at the single set of tire tracks in the dust that could have been from any vehicle, or from mine, or from nothing at all. "I'm on my way," I said. The debriefing at the Riggins office lasted 3 hours. Frank sat me down in the conference room with a cup of coffee and a legal pad, and I went through everything again, this time leaving nothing out. The tent, the footprints, the sound of the river coming from the wrong direction, the missing vehicle that supposedly never existed in the first place. To his credit, Frank didn't laugh or suggest I'd lost my mind. He just took notes and asked clarifying questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. "This isn't the first time," he finally said. I looked at him. "What do you mean?" Frank pulled out a file folder I hadn't noticed before. Old thing, the kind that's been moved from filing cabinet to filing cabinet for decades, with coffee stains on the cover and edges worn soft. He opened it and slid a photograph across the table. It showed a young man, maybe 30 years old, in 1970s-style camping gear. He was smiling at the camera, standing next to a river I recognized immediately as the Snake. Written on the back in faded pencil, "Michael Rostov, Hell's Canyon, June 1976. "Michael Rostov," Frank said. "BLM Ranger. Worked this area from 1974 to 1977. He put in a report about an incident that sounds a lot like what you described. Found a campsite that shouldn't have been there. Heard water running upstream. Lost 6 hours of time. After that, he requested a transfer to the Boise office. Wouldn't talk about what happened, but he wouldn't set foot in the canyon again either." "Did anyone investigate?" "Of course. Found nothing. No evidence of any campsite where he said it had been. But here's the thing, Caleb. After he left, we pulled the visitor logs from 1976. There was a missing person report filed that June. A solo hiker, woman named Teresa Millhouse. She was supposed to check in with her brother and never did. We searched for 3 weeks and never found a trace." He slid another photograph across the table. This one showed a Chevy station wagon, wood-paneled, parked at what I recognized as the Dry Creek trailhead. "Her vehicle," Frank said. "It was there when Rostov went in, gone when he came out. Then it turned up 2 weeks later in a parking lot in Lewiston, 200 miles away. Clean as a whistle, no forensic evidence, nothing. Teresa Millhouse was never seen again." The coffee in my hand had gone cold. "You're telling me this has happened before." "I'm telling you Hell's Canyon has patterns," Frank said. things that repeat. I've been working this area for 23 years, Caleb. I've seen enough to know there are places in this canyon where the rules don't quite work right. Most of the time, nothing happens. People hike in, hike out, see some elk, catch some fish, go home with nice photos. But every few years, something goes wrong in a way that doesn't make sense. Then why didn't you warn me? Because 99% of the time, nothing happens. And if I told every new ranger that the canyon was haunted or cursed or whatever the hell it is, I'd never be able to staff the place. Besides, what would I have said? Hey, Caleb, by the way, sometimes the river runs backward and tents disappear? You'd have thought I was crazy. He wasn't wrong. I wouldn't have believed him. Hell, I barely believed it now, and I'd experienced it firsthand. So, what do we do? I asked. Frank closed the file folder. We follow procedure. We call in the SAR team, we search the area, we document everything, and if we don't find Dana Whitlock, we file a report and we move on. Same as we always do. That's it? We just move on? What else can we do? We can't explain it, we can't predict it, we can't stop it. All we can do is our jobs. He looked at me steadily. And maybe, if you're smart, you'll request a transfer like Rostov did. There's no shame in it. But I didn't request a transfer. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was the part of me that needed to understand what had happened out there. Whatever the reason, I stayed. The search and rescue team arrived that afternoon. 6 rangers, 2 SAR dogs, and a helicopter crew on standby. We spent 4 days combing every inch of the Dry Creek Trail and the surrounding area. We found nothing. No tent, no footprints, no sign that Dana Whitlock had ever been there. The RAV-4 never turned up. Neither did she. On the 5th day, Frank got a call from the Spokane Police Department. Dana Whitlock had been found safe at a coffee shop in Spokane, Washington, 300 miles away. She was confused and disoriented with no memory of the past week. The last thing she remembered was going to bed in her apartment on Monday night. It was now Friday. She had injuries, scratches on her arms and legs, dirt under her fingernails, blisters on her feet consistent with extensive hiking, but no explanation for them. Her apartment showed no signs of forced entry or struggle. Her Subaru was still parked in its assigned spot. The only unusual thing was that her hiking gear was missing from her closet, including her 2-person green North Face tent. The doctors called it a dissociative fugue state, possibly triggered by stress. The police filed a report and closed the case. No crime, no evidence of foul play, just a woman who'd somehow lost a week of her life and ended up 300 miles from home with no memory of how she got there. I read the report when Frank shared it with me, and all I could think about was those footprints leading into the river. 14 bare footprints, ending at the water's edge, pointing upstream toward a sound that came from the wrong direction. I went back to work. Patrols, visitor assistance, trail maintenance, all the normal ranger duties. But I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. The way sound sometimes bounced strangely off the canyon walls. The spots where my radio would cut out for no apparent reason. The places where the air felt different, thicker somehow, like walking through invisible water. And I started keeping a log. Nothing official, just a personal notebook where I documented the small anomalies I encountered. A trail marker that moved positions. A tree that showed up on my GPS but wasn't there when I hiked to the coordinates. A section of river where fish only swam upstream, never down. 3 months passed. Winter settled into the canyon, bringing snow to the high country and ice to the river's edge. Visitation dropped to almost nothing. Only the hardiest enthusiasts venture into Hell's Canyon in winter. Which made it strange when I got a call about a fisherman who'd been reported overdue. His name was Robert Smith. 47 years old, experienced outdoorsman, had been fishing the Snake River for 20 years. He'd told his wife he was doing a 2-day trip, planning to camp somewhere along the canyon. When he didn't come home on schedule, she'd called us. I took the call with a sense of dread that I couldn't quite shake. Something about it felt familiar, too familiar. Where was he planning to fish? I asked Frank. His wife says he had a favorite spot, Box Canyon, where Dry Creek meets the Snake River. Of course he did. This time, I wasn't going in alone. Frank assigned another ranger to come with me. A guy named Tom Caleb, 41 years old, former Marine, been with the BLM for 3 years. Good man to have at your back. I briefed him on the basics. Missing fishermen, experienced outdoorsmen, probable campsite location. I didn't mention the tent that vanished or the river that flowed backward. Not yet. We headed out on a gray Tuesday morning, temperature hovering just above freezing. The Dry Creek Trail was icy in places, requiring careful footing. We made good time despite the conditions, reaching the Box Canyon by early afternoon. Robert Smith's truck was parked at the trailhead, exactly where it should have been. A blue Ford F-150 with Idaho plates and a Gone Fishing bumper sticker. We checked it out, nothing unusual, then headed down the trail. The Box Canyon looked different in winter. The vegetation had died back, leaving bare branches and exposed rock. The Snake River was running lower than it had been in September, revealing muddy banks that normally stayed underwater. Ice had formed along the edges, thin sheets that caught the weak sunlight and glinted like broken glass. We found the camp about 50 yards from the river. Unlike Dana Whitlock's invisible tent, this one was very real and very much present. A 2-person dome tent, blue and gray, properly staked down. Next to it, a camping chair was set up facing the water. A small propane stove sat on a flat rock, and I could see a cooler half hidden behind a boulder. "Mr. Smith," Tom called out. "Robert Smith, this is the Bureau of Land Management. We're here to check on your welfare." No response except the sound of the river. Not the amplified echoing roar I'd heard in September, just the normal rush of moving water. But something about it still sounded wrong, off-key somehow, like an instrument that's slightly out of tune. Tom approached the tent while I checked the perimeter. The ground around the campsite was frozen, the dirt hard as concrete. I could see boot prints leading from the tent down to the river, but they were old, probably from when Smith had first set up camp. No fresh tracks, no signs of recent activity. "Caleb," Tom said quietly, "you need to see this." I walked over to where he stood by the tent. The entrance was partially unzipped, and through the opening I could see inside. A sleeping bag neatly rolled, a backpack propped in one corner, a pair of boots set side by side, laces tied, and water. Lots of water. The entire floor of the tent was covered in maybe 2 inches of it, perfectly still, reflecting the gray sky like a mirror. "Did the river flood?" Tom asked. "River's running low," I said. "Hasn't been high enough to reach this spot in months." "Then where'd the water come from?" I didn't have an answer. We stood there for a moment, both of us staring at that impossible pool of water inside the tent. Then Tom reached down and touched it. His finger broke the surface, sending ripples spreading outward. "It's warm," he said. "Not hot, but warm, like bath water." That's when we heard the splash. Both of us turned toward the river. About 30 feet from shore, the water had erupted in a fountain of spray, as if something large had just broken the surface from below. But nothing breached. No fish, no log, nothing. Just that single splash, and then calm water again. "What the hell was that?" Tom said. Another splash, this time closer to shore. Then another and another, forming a line of disturbances moving upstream against the current. Whatever was causing them was underwater, invisible, heading toward the southern end of the canyon. Upstream, against the current, exactly like the footprints I'd found in September. "Tom," I said carefully, "we need to leave. Right now." He looked at me like I'd grown a second head. "What? We haven't searched the area yet. Smith could be injured somewhere. He could need help." "I've been here before," I said. "Not this exact situation, but close enough. Trust me, we need to go." "Caleb, what are you talking about?" I was about to answer when the river sound changed. It didn't get louder or softer, but the quality of it altered, becoming deeper, more resonant. And underneath it, I could hear that same thing I'd heard in September. Voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all talking at once in words I couldn't understand. Tom heard it too. I could see it in his face, the way his eyes widened, the way he instinctively reached for his radio. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. The splashes were all around us now, in the water, on the shore, even in the air above our heads. Invisible impacts that sent spray flying but revealed nothing. The voices grew louder, more insistent, and now I could make out individual words: down and under, and follow, and home. The water inside Smith's tent was rising. I could see it through the open flap, climbing up the walls of the tent, defying gravity, spreading across the ceiling like a living thing. It was perfectly clear, perfectly still, and in its surface I could see reflections that didn't match our surroundings. People, faces, looking up at us from within the water as if we were the ones underwater and they were looking down from above. "Run," I said. We ran. Tom was ahead of me, his longer legs eating up the distance. I followed, trying not to think about the wet slapping sounds behind us that had no business being there on frozen ground. The splashing had spread to the trail itself now, invisible feet running through invisible water, keeping pace with us stride for stride. We'd made it maybe half a mile when Tom suddenly stopped. He was staring at something on the trail ahead, his hand raised in a gesture I recognized. "Hold position." "Caleb," he said softly, "tell me you see that." I looked past him and felt my blood run cold. There was a man standing in the middle of the trail, perfectly ordinary-looking guy, maybe 50 years old, wearing waders and a fishing vest. He was soaking wet, water streaming off him, pooling around his boots, and he was holding a fishing rod, the line trailing off into empty air. "Robert Smith?" Tom called out. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, rod held at chest height, staring at us with an expression that wasn't quite blank but wasn't quite there either. Like he was looking at us from a very great distance. "Mr. Smith, we're with the Bureau of Land Management. Are you injured? Do you need assistance?" Nothing. The man's chest didn't rise or fall. Water continued to run off him in streams, but his clothes didn't get any drier. And his fishing line, I could see it now more clearly, wasn't trailing into the air at all. It was trailing into water. Into a vertical column of water that hung in space like a curtain, extending from the ground up into the sky, visible only where the fishing line intersected it. Tom started to move toward him. I grabbed his arm. "Don't!" "But he's right there. That's not Robert Smith," I said. "Or if it is, he's not here, not really." The figure's head tilted slightly the way a dog's does when it hears a strange sound. Then it smiled. Not a happy smile, not a threatening smile. Just a smile that showed too many teeth and lasted too long. "Follow," it said. The voice wasn't quite right, like someone talking underwater. "Follow down. Follow home. Follow into the deep, where the river runs true." The column of water behind it expanded, spreading outward, and through it I could see another place, Still Hell's Canyon, but different. The sun was in the wrong position, the canyon walls the wrong color, and the Snake River was flowing uphill, climbing toward the sky in a cascade that defied everything I understood about gravity and physics and reality itself. In that upside-down river, I could see people. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all floating in the current, all wearing expressions like the man on the trail. Not quite here, not quite there, caught between. Teresa Milhouse was one of them. I recognized her face from the old photograph Frank had shown me. Still young, still trapped in 1976. Next to her floated others I didn't recognize. Hikers, fishermen, campers. All of them lost to the canyon over the years, all of them still here in whatever impossible place this was. And in the distance, deeper in that impossible river, I saw something else. Something huge and dark and ancient, moving through the water with a grace that nothing that size should possess. It didn't have a shape I could comprehend, just a sense of massive presence, of something so old and vast that human understanding couldn't contain it. The column of water moved toward us. The man-thing stepped aside to let it pass, still smiling that wrong smile. Tom was backing up, his hand on his sidearm even though we both knew bullets wouldn't help. "Whatever you do," I said, "don't touch the water." The curtain of water was maybe 10 feet away when it stopped. It hung there, rippling gently, and I could hear voices coming from within it. Calling, beckoning, promising. "Come down," they said. "Come home. Come to where the river runs true and time flows backward. Come to where everything lost is found. Come home, come home, come home." And God help me, part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to step into that water and let it carry me away to wherever it led, to solve the mystery that had been eating at me since September. To understand. But the smarter part, the part that wanted to live, that wanted to see my family again, that understood some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, won out. "We're leaving," I said. "Now." We backed away slowly, carefully, not turning our backs on the water curtain or the man-thing or any of it. Step by step we retreated up the trail, and after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the impossible things began to fade. The curtain of water grew translucent, then invisible. The man-thing melted back into the landscape. The voices quieted to whispers, then to nothing. The normal sounds of the canyon returned. Wind through trees, the ordinary rush of the river, the cry of a hawk somewhere high above. By the time we reached the trailhead, it was as if nothing had happened. Just 2 rangers emerging from a routine search and rescue mission. Robert Smith's truck was gone. In its place was a neat pile of personal effects: wallet, keys, wedding ring, watch. On top was a fishing rod, the line trailing off into empty air, the hook baited with nothing at all. We didn't file an official report about what happened with the water curtain. How could we? There was no body, no evidence, nothing that would stand up to any kind of scrutiny. Tom and I sat in my truck for 2 hours, trying to figure out what to say, before we finally just agreed on the basics. We found Smith's camp, no sign of Smith himself, personal effects recovered, presumed drowned. It wasn't a lie, exactly. The river had taken him, one way or another. Tom requested a transfer 2 weeks later. I don't blame him. Frank approved it without question, and Tom was in the Boise office by the end of the month. I heard through the grapevine that he's doing fine, working visitor services, never going into the backcountry anymore. Smart man. I should have requested a transfer too. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to get out while I still could, to leave Hell's Canyon to someone else, someone who didn't know what lurked in that box canyon where Dry Creek met the Snake. But I didn't leave. Couldn't leave. because I'd seen those faces in the water, all those missing people trapped in whatever impossible place that was, and I kept thinking, what if there was a way to help them? What if understanding what was happening could somehow lead to a solution? So I stayed, and I kept my log, and I started doing something that probably crossed the line from diligence into obsession. I began researching every missing person case in Hell's Canyon going back as far as the records went. It turned out there were a lot of them. 73 people had vanished in the canyon since the BLM started keeping detailed records in 1968. 73 individuals who'd walked into the wilderness and never walked out, leaving behind nothing but questions and grieving families. Not all of them were connected to the Box Canyon, of course. Some were legitimate accidents, falls, drownings, heart attacks in remote locations where the body was never recovered. But 12 of them had last been seen in or near that specific stretch of river. 12 people over 41 years, an average of one every 3 to 4 years, all of them vanishing without a trace. I made a spreadsheet. Names, dates, circumstances, any unusual details in the reports. Patterns started to emerge. Most disappearances happened in late summer or early winter, September through October, or December through January. All of the missing people were alone when they vanished. And in every case where personal effects were recovered, they'd been found arranged neatly, almost ceremonially, as if whoever, or whatever, was taking these people wanted to leave a calling card. I also started checking weather records. And here's where things got really strange. Every single disappearance coincided with unusual atmospheric conditions in the canyon. Pressure anomalies, temperature inversions, unexplained fog banks, the kind of meteorological events that happen maybe once or twice a year, if that. It was like the canyon was opening somehow, creating conditions where the barrier between our world and wherever those people went became thin enough to cross. I showed my research to Frank. He listened, looked at my spreadsheet, studied the weather correlations. Then he closed my laptop and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Caleb," he said, "I'm going to tell you something I should have told you months ago. Something I should have told every ranger I've supervised over the past 23 years but didn't because I'm a coward." He pulled out that old file folder again, the one with Michael Rostov's case. But this time he opened it to a section I hadn't seen before. Handwritten notes in faded ink, dated 1977. "These are Rostov's personal observations," Frank said. He didn't include them in his official report because he knew he'd sound crazy, but he gave them to his supervisor before he left, with instructions to pass them on to whoever took over his patrol sector. They've been passed down, ranger to ranger, for over 30 years, and now I'm passing them to you. I read the notes. They confirmed everything I'd suspected and added details I hadn't imagined. Rostov had gone back to the Box Canyon multiple times after his initial encounter, trying to understand what was happening. He'd documented the atmospheric conditions, the sound anomalies, the way time seemed to behave differently in that location. And he'd developed a theory. According to Rostov, the Snake River had carved Hell's Canyon over millions of years, cutting deeper and deeper into the Earth's crust. But somewhere along the way, it had cut into something else, something old, something that existed in a different relationship to time and space than our world does. He called it the Deep River, a current that flowed beneath and through our reality, following rules we couldn't understand. Most of the time, the Deep River and the Snake River existed separately, never touching. But occasionally, under the right conditions, they would overlap. The Box Canyon was one of the points where this overlap was most likely to occur, and when the two rivers merged, things from one could slip into the other. The people who disappear, Rostov had written, they don't die. They fall into the Deep River, and once you're in that current, you can't get out. You just flow with it, forever, always moving but never arriving, existing in all times and no time simultaneously. The notes ended with a warning. Do not try to save them. You cannot pull someone out of the deep river without falling in yourself. The only choice is to stay away when the rivers merge and hope that eventually they'll separate permanently. I looked up at Frank. You've known about this for 23 years. Yes. And you never closed the area? Never warned anyone? Close it on what grounds? File a report saying there's a magical river that steals people? Come on, Caleb, you know how that would go. He rubbed his eyes. The best we can do is what we've always done. Respond to missing persons reports, search the area, and hope that most people visit the canyon when the conditions are normal. We can't predict when the rivers will merge. We can't prevent it. All we can do is deal with the aftermath. That's not good enough. I know, Frank said quietly. But it's all we have. I went home that night and barely slept. I kept seeing those faces in the water, all those people caught in the current of the deep river, aware but unable to escape. 73 people. 12 in that one location alone. How many more in other places where the rivers touched? And I kept thinking about something else Rostov had written. The entity in the depths. I don't know what it is, but I don't think it's hostile. I think it's curious. It collects things that fall into its river the way we might collect interesting rocks from a stream bed. It doesn't understand that we're alive, that we're suffering. To it, we're just objects carried by the current. The next day was a Friday. I took a personal day, drove to the Box Canyon Ranger Station, and requisitioned a boat. If anyone asked, I was doing a river patrol. If no one asked, well, I'd just be gone for a few hours. I motored up the Snake River to the Box Canyon, cutting the engine when I got close and letting the current carry me in. It was late January, cold enough that ice was forming along the banks. The conditions were ordinary. No pressure anomalies, no temperature inversions, no fog. The rivers were separate. I tied up at the same spot where I'd found Dana Whitlock's tent back in September. Then, I sat on a rock and waited. I'm not sure what I was hoping for. A revelation, a solution. Maybe I just needed to face the place again on my own terms, without the terror of running for my life. Hours passed. The sun tracked across the strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. I ate a sandwich, drank some water, listened to the normal, predictable sound of the river flowing downhill the way rivers are supposed to flow. Around 3 o'clock, I noticed something. A slight change in the air pressure, like the feeling you get before a thunderstorm. The temperature dropped a few degrees in the space of a minute, and the river sound began to change, developing that deeper resonance I'd heard before. The rivers were merging. I should have left. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in the boat and get the hell out of there. But I stayed. I needed to see it with my own eyes, in daylight without panic clouding my judgment. The air above the river began to shimmer, like heat haze but cold. Through the shimmer, I could see that other place, the upside-down canyon where the river flowed skyward and time moved sideways. The water in front of me began to rise, forming shapes, reaching toward me like curious fingers. And then I saw her. Dana Whitlock. Standing in the water, in the deep river, looking at me with those same distant eyes I'd seen in the Robert Smith manifestation. But there was something else in her expression now. Recognition. She raised one hand, not beckoning, not threatening, just pointing upstream, pointing south. I looked where she was pointing and saw it. A section of the canyon wall where the rock face had cracked and crumbled, revealing a cave mouth I'd never noticed before. No, not a cave. A doorway, a threshold between the rivers. The water shapes pulled back, giving me a clear path, an invitation. I understood then what Rostov had meant. The entity in the deep river wasn't hostile. It was offering a choice. I could step through that doorway, enter the deep river, and maybe understand what had happened to all those missing people. Maybe I could even communicate with whatever vast intelligence moved in those depths. But I'd never come back. That much was certain. One step through that threshold and I'd be caught in the current forever, existing in all times and no time, aware but unable to act, another face in the water for the next ranger to see. I took a step forward, then another. The water was cold around my ankles, but it didn't feel wet. It felt like nothing, like absence, like stepping into a space where the normal rules of matter didn't apply. Dana's expression changed. For just a moment, I saw her truly aware, truly present. And she shook her head. A tiny motion, barely perceptible, but clear. No, don't. I stepped back. The water released me, flowing away like it had never been there. The shimmer in the air faded. The deep river and the Snake River separated, and the canyon returned to normal. When I looked again, Dana was gone, but something had been left behind. A pattern of stones on the riverbank, arranged in a shape I recognized from my geology textbooks. An arrow pointing downstream, pointing toward Pittsburgh Landing, pointing toward home. I got back in my boat and left. I didn't look back. That was 11 years ago. I transferred out of Hell's Canyon 6 months later, took a position with the BLM in Montana. Easier terrain, fewer missing persons, no deep rivers that flowed in impossible directions. I'm married now, have 2 kids, work a desk job coordinating search and rescue operations across 3 states. I'm good at it, maybe because I understand, better than most, what can happen when searches fail. Frank retired in 2015. We still exchange Christmas cards. He's never mentioned Hell's Canyon in any of them, and neither have I. Some things are better left in the past. But I still have nightmares. Not about the water curtain or the entity in the depths or even about the faces of the missing people. My nightmares are about that moment on the riverbank when I almost stepped through. The moment when I wanted to. When the mystery was so compelling. The call of understanding so strong that I nearly gave up everything to satisfy it. Because here's the thing I've learned. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some questions don't have answers that a human mind can comprehend. And some places in this world, or beneath it, or alongside it, exist according to rules we'll never understand. Hell's Canyon is still open to the public. People still hike the Dry Creek Trail, still camp in the Box Canyon where the 2 rivers sometimes merge. Most of them have perfectly ordinary trips and go home with nothing more exciting to report than maybe seeing some elk or catching a few rainbow trout. But every few years, someone doesn't come home. Someone camps in the wrong place at the wrong time, when the atmospheric conditions are just right and the barrier between the rivers grows thin, and they hear the voices in the water calling them, and they see the faces of all the others who came before, and they have to make a choice. I made mine. I chose to live, to come home, to accept that there are things in this world I'll never understand. Most people make the same choice, even if they don't realize they're making it. They feel that something's wrong, that the rules aren't working quite right, and they leave before the rivers can take them. But some people don't leave. Some people accept the invitation. They step into the deep river, and they join all the others in that current that flows through time and space in directions we can't perceive. And they become part of the mystery, one more face in the water, one more name on a missing persons list. One more grief-stricken family left wondering what happened. I think about Dana Whitlock sometimes, about that moment when she warned me away, when she used the last shred of her consciousness to save me from making the same mistake she'd made. I hope that wherever she is, whatever she's become, she has some measure of peace, but I suspect that's wishful thinking on my part. The deep river doesn't care about our peace. It doesn't care about our suffering or our joy or our brief human lives. It just flows, eternal and inexorable, following rules older than mountains, deeper than oceans, stranger than anything we can imagine. And sometimes, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you can hear it calling, promising answers, promising understanding, promising home. Don't listen. Don't look too long at the water when it begins to flow in the wrong direction. Don't follow the voices or the footprints that point upstream. And if you ever find yourself at a campsite where the tent is dry on the inside and wet on the outside, where the river sound comes from the wrong direction, where the rules start to bend and break, leave. Run if you have to. There's no shame in it. Because some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some rivers flow to places we were never meant to go. And some sacrifices, the sacrifice of curiosity, of understanding, of knowing, are necessary if you want to survive. I survived. I got out. I went home. But the ones who didn't, the 73 names on my list, and however many more came before the record started, and whoever might come after, they're still there. Still flowing in the deep river, existing in all times and no time, forever caught between one moment and the next. I can't save them, nobody can. The best I can do is tell this story and hope that someone, somewhere, will read it and remember it if they ever find themselves in a box canyon where Dry Creek meets the Snake River, where the water sounds wrong and the air feels different and voices call from the depths. If that ever happens to you, remember, you have a choice. The deep river offers understanding, offers answers, offers secrets older than humanity itself, but it costs everything. Choose wisely. My name is Fiona Merryweather, and I spent 8 years working as a wilderness ranger for the U.S. Forest Service in the Hells Canyon Wilderness area along the Idaho-Oregon border. When people ask me why I left, I usually give them the easy answer. Better pay, less isolation, closer to family. All of that's true, but it's not the real reason. The real reason is Ralph Kinman, not because of anything he did wrong, mind you. Ralph was a good man, a careful ranger, someone you'd want watching your back in rough country. But what happened to him, what we both experienced during those 3 days in August of 2011, that's what drove me out of Hells Canyon and into a nice, safe desk job with the Forest Service in Boise. I've never told this story before, not the whole thing anyway. My supervisor at the time, a woman named Barbara Hendricks, advised me to keep certain details out of the official report. Stick to the facts we can verify, she said. Leave out the parts that make us sound crazy. So, that's what I did. But the truth has a way of eating at you from the inside, and after 12 years, I think it's time to let it out. Let me start by painting you a picture of Hells Canyon in August. The summer heat bakes the canyon walls until they radiate warmth long after sunset. The Snake River runs low and lazy, exposing gravel bars and rock formations that stay hidden during the spring runoff. It's rattlesnake season, which means you watch every step, and it's fire season, which means you're always on edge, always scanning the horizon for smoke. It's also peak visitor season. Fishermen, rafters, backpackers, they all descend on the canyon during those few months when the weather's tolerable and the river's accessible. Most of them are experienced outdoors people who know how to handle themselves, but you still get the occasional yahoo who thinks wilderness means free-for-all and ends up needing rescue. On August 11, 2011, I was stationed at the Granite Creek Ranger Station, which is basically a rustic cabin with a radio and a composting toilet about 15 miles south of Pittsburgh Landing. It's remote even by Hell's Canyon standards. No road access, no electricity, just solar panels that barely keep the radio batteries charged. You get there by boat or by foot, and once you're there, you're pretty much on your own. I'd been at Kirkwood for 6 days, doing routine patrols, checking on camping permits, making sure people weren't harassing the wildlife or leaving trash everywhere. It was lonely work, but I'd always preferred solitude to crowds. That's why I became a wilderness ranger in the first place. On the morning of the 11th, I got a radio call from Barbara. She sounded tense, which was unusual. Barbara was normally unflappable, the kind of person who could handle 3 emergencies at once without breaking a sweat. "Fiona, we've got a situation developing," she said. "I need you to check on Ralph Kinman. He was supposed to radio in this morning from Granite Creek, and we haven't heard from him." Ralph Kinman was another wilderness ranger assigned to the northern section of the canyon. We'd worked together a few times and I liked him. He was in his mid-50s, a former fishing guide who'd joined the Forest Service after his kids grew up. Calm, methodical, knew the canyon as well as anyone. "When was his last check-in?" I asked. "Yesterday afternoon, around 3, said he was heading to Granite Creek to investigate a report of illegal camping. Should have taken him maybe 2 hours to get there, but he never called back." Granite Creek was about 8 miles north of my position, a solid 4-hour hike through rough terrain, or a 90-minute boat ride if the river cooperated. "You want me to go check on him?" "Yes, but be careful. The report he was investigating—" She paused, and I heard papers rustling in the background. It was strange. Caller said they'd seen someone camped on the rocks above Granite Creek, but when they got closer, there was nobody there. Just gear scattered around like someone had left in a hurry. Ralph went to check it out, but that's the last we heard. Could his radio be dead? Possible, but unlikely. He had fresh batteries, and he's too experienced to let his equipment fail. I've got a bad feeling about this, Fiona. Can you head up there and see what's going on?" I told her I'd leave within the hour. After we signed off, I packed my gear: first aid kit, emergency bivvy, water purification tablets, rope, flares, extra batteries for my radio and headlamp. I also strapped on my sidearm, a Glock 22, standard issue. In all my years as a ranger, I'd never had to draw it, but Hell's Canyon has its share of black bears and mountain lions, and it's better to have it and not need it than vice versa. The Snake River was running smooth that morning, which was a blessing. I fired up the ranger station's aluminum boat, a 16-foot flat bottom with a 25-horsepower outboard, and headed upstream. The canyon walls rose up on either side, massive layers of basalt and granite that had been carved by millions of years of water flow. In some places, those walls climbed nearly a mile straight up, creating shadows so deep that sunlight never reaches the river's surface. It's beautiful country, don't get me wrong, but there's something about Hell's Canyon that's always felt a little off to me. Like the wilderness there is older than wilderness should be, if that makes any sense. The Nez Perce people have stories about spirits in the canyon, about places where the rules of the world work differently. I'd always dismissed those stories as folklore, the kind of thing you tell around a campfire to scare tourists. After what happened with Ralph, I'm not so sure anymore. The boat ride took about an hour and 40 minutes. I kept the throttle moderate, scanning the riverbanks for any sign of Ralph or his gear. The Snake River isn't particularly wide in this section, maybe 100 yards across, so it's easy to see both shores. But I didn't spot anything unusual until I reached the mouth of Granite Creek. That's when I saw Ralph's boat. It was pulled up on a gravel bar, properly beached and tied off to a large boulder. The boat looked fine. No damage, no signs of struggle. Ralph's orange dry bag was still secured in the bow, which meant he'd left in a hurry or he planned to come right back. No wilderness ranger leaves their gear unattended unless they have a good reason. I killed my engine and drifted in next to Ralph's boat, then hopped out and pulled mine up onto the gravel. The morning sun was already heating the rocks, and I could feel sweat gathering under my uniform. I called out, "Ralph! Ralph Kinman! It's Fiona Merryweather!" Nothing. Just the sound of the river and the occasional cry of a hawk circling somewhere high above. I checked Ralph's boat more thoroughly. His radio was there, sitting in its waterproof case, which explained why he hadn't been calling in. Whatever had pulled him away from the boat had happened fast enough that he didn't think to grab his radio. That was the first thing that worried me. Granite Creek itself is more of a seasonal drainage than a proper creek, a rocky channel that only runs with water during the spring melt or after heavy rains. In August, it's dry, just a jumble of rocks and boulders leading up into the canyon wall. The report Barbara mentioned had said something about illegal camping on the rocks above Granite Creek, which could mean anywhere in a fairly large area. I started hiking up the drainage, following boot prints in the dust that I assumed were Ralph's. The prints were deep and evenly spaced. He'd been moving at a normal pace, not running, not struggling. About 200 yards up from the river, the drainage opened into a small flat area, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by massive boulders. And that's where I found the first wet ring. It was on top of a flat boulder, roughly circular, about 3 feet in diameter. The rock inside the ring was wet, not damp, but soaking wet, like someone had just poured a bucket of water on it. The rock outside the ring was bone dry, baked by the summer heat. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It hadn't rained in over 2 weeks. There was no water source nearby. Granite Creek was completely dry at this elevation, and the wetness wasn't spreading or evaporating. It just sat there, perfectly contained within that circular boundary. I knelt down and touched the wet rock. It was cold. Not cool, but cold, like it had been submerged in ice water. And it had a smell. Not unpleasant exactly, but strange. Mineral heavy, like the smell of a deep cave or an old well. I took out my camera and snapped a few photos. Then I stood up and looked around, trying to spot any obvious explanation. That's when I noticed that Ralph's boot prints led directly to the boulder with the wet ring, then stopped. Just stopped. No prints leading away, no signs of him climbing over the boulder or circling around it. The tracks ended right there, as if he'd stepped onto the rock and vanished. "Ralph!" I called again, louder this time. My voice echoed off the canyon walls, came back to me distorted and strange. "Ralph, if you can hear me, respond." Silence. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Ranger Merryweather at Granite Creek. I've found Ralph's boat and tracks, but no sign of Ralph himself. I've also found something unusual, some kind of water marking on a rock. Please advise, over." Static. I tried again, adjusting the squelch and checking my battery. The radio seemed to be working fine, but I couldn't raise base. Not uncommon in the deep parts of the canyon, the walls block radio signals, and you have to get to high ground if you want reliable communication. I decided to climb higher, see if I could get a better vantage point and maybe get my radio working. The terrain above the flat area got steep in a hurry, but there was a decent trail, probably made by bighorn sheep, that switchbacked up the canyon wall. I followed it, stopping every few minutes to call for Ralph and to try my radio. About 20 minutes into the climb, I found the second wet ring. This one was on a vertical rock face, which made even less sense than the first. It was the same size, same perfect circle, same soaking wet surface surrounded by dry rock. And it was cold to the touch, with that same strange mineral smell. But here's the thing that really bothered me. The wet ring was about 6 feet off the ground. If someone had thrown water at the rock, you'd expect splatter, drips, some kind of irregular pattern. This was perfectly circular, perfectly even, like someone had pressed a wet stamp against the stone. I took more photos and kept climbing. The third wet ring appeared 50 yards higher, on another flat boulder. The fourth was on a slanted rock surface. The fifth was on the ground, in a patch of bare dirt. Each one was identical. 3 feet in diameter, perfectly circular, soaking wet, cold, and smelling of minerals. And each one was as placed along the route Ralph's boot prints had been following before they disappeared. By the time I found the 6th wet ring, I was seriously rattled. This wasn't natural. This couldn't be natural. But I couldn't come up with any explanation that made sense. Who would hike into the backcountry with buckets of water just to pour them in circles on rocks? And even if someone did, how would they get the water to stay wet in this heat? How would they make perfect circles every time? I kept climbing. The trail, if you could still call it that, had become more of a route-finding exercise, scrambling over boulders and through narrow gaps between rock walls. I was starting to regret not bringing more water. The temperature had climbed into the 90s and I was sweating through my uniform. And then I heard it. A sound, low and rhythmic, almost like breathing, but deeper. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the canyon walls in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint a direction. I froze, listening. The sound continued for maybe 15 seconds, then stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I became aware of something else. All the normal ambient noise had disappeared. No birds, no insects, no wind rustling through the sparse vegetation. Just dead, oppressive silence like the canyon was holding its breath. "Ralph!" I called out, but my voice sounded wrong, muffled, like I was speaking underwater. Then I heard something else. A splash. The unmistakable sound of something large hitting water, but there was no water nearby. The Snake River was hundreds of feet below, and Granite Creek was bone dry. The splash came again, closer this time, and I realized with a sick feeling in my stomach that it was coming from above me. I looked up. The canyon wall rose another 200 feet, ending in a ragged rim where the basalt layers had fractured and crumbled. I couldn't see anything moving up there, no obvious source for the sound. But the splashing continued, regular as a heartbeat. Splash, pause, splash, pause, splash, and then I saw the water. It was running down the rock face, a thin sheet of liquid that caught the sunlight and glittered as it descended. But it wasn't running downward. It was running up, defying gravity, flowing from the bottom of the cliff toward the top, disappearing over the rim in a miniature waterfall that went the wrong direction. I stood there, watching that impossible water climb the canyon wall, and every rational part of my brain was screaming that this couldn't be real, that I was dehydrated or suffering from heat stroke or experiencing some kind of altitude-induced hallucination. But I wasn't imagining the cold. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees in the space of a minute. I could see my breath misting in the air, even though moments ago I'd been sweating in 90-degree heat. The upward flowing water began to spread, forming patterns on the rock face. Not random patterns, deliberate shapes, circles, dozens of them, 3 feet in diameter each, arranged in a grid that covered a section of cliff maybe 50 feet wide and 30 feet tall. And in the center of each circle, I saw a face. Not human faces, not animal faces. Something else, something with features that didn't quite make sense, that hurt to look at too directly. They were watching me. All of them, dozens of pairs of eyes that weren't quite eyes, staring down from those wet circles on the rock. I did the only sensible thing. I ran. I scrambled back down the slope, half falling over rocks, scraping my hands and knees but not caring. The faces in the wet circles, if you could call them faces, stayed fixed on me the whole time, dozens of not-quite eyes tracking my descent. I didn't look back, couldn't look back. My brain was rejecting what I'd seen, trying to categorize it as hallucination, as some trick of light and shadow, as anything except what it obviously was. Something impossible was happening in Hell's Canyon, and Ralph Kinman was caught in the middle of it. I made it back to the flat area where I'd found the first wet ring. It was still there, still soaking wet, still cold, but now there was something else. Footprints, fresh boot prints, appearing in the dust around the boulder, leading away from the wet ring toward the river. Ralph's boots. I followed them at a run, my hand instinctively moving to my sidearm, even though I knew damn well that bullets wouldn't help with whatever I'd just seen. The tracks led down Granite Creek drainage, back toward the gravel bar where our boats were tied. But when I got there, Ralph's boat was gone. Not dragged away, not capsized, not damaged, just gone. The rope that had secured it to the boulder was still tied in place, the end frayed as if it had been cut, but cut from the inside, if that makes any sense. The end that had been attached to the boat was missing. My own boat was still there, exactly as I'd left it. I stood on the gravel bar, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what was happening. Ralph's footprints led right to where his boat had been, then continued into the river. Into the water, the prints were visible in the wet gravel at the river's edge, clear as day, and they didn't stop or turn around. They just kept going, step after step, walking straight into the Snake River. I waded into the water, following the prints as far as I could. They continued along the river bottom, visible through the clear water, getting deeper and deeper. At waist depth, I stopped. The current was strong here, and I'm a good swimmer, but not good enough to risk going further without a life jacket. The footprints continued into the deep channel, where the riverbed dropped off into darkness. I waded back to shore, my pants and boots soaking wet, my mind racing. I needed to radio this in, needed to get help, needed to... My boat's engine was running. I hadn't started it. I knew I hadn't started it. But the outboard motor was chugging away at idle speed, the propeller churning water, the whole boat vibrating slightly against its tie rope. And then, as I stood there staring, the engine noise stopped. Not gradually, like someone had turned it off. It just cut out, mid-cycle, as if the sound had been swallowed. But the engine was still running. I could see the propeller spinning, could see the exhaust bubbles coming up from the water, could see the boat vibrating. It was running silently. I approached slowly, hand on my Glock, which was stupid because what was I going to do? Shoot my own boat? But the wrongness of it, an outboard motor running without making any sound, was so profound that every instinct I had was screaming danger. I reached the boat and touched the motor housing. It was hot, the way a running engine should be. The throttle was at idle, exactly where I'd left it. Except I'd turned the engine off before I left. Hadn't I? I tried to remember, but the memory was slippery, uncertain. I turned the key to the off position. The engine kept running silently. I turned it again, yanked it out of the ignition, and the engine finally died. In the silence that followed, I heard splashing again. Not from above this time, but from the river itself. Rhythmic splashes, moving upstream against the current. I turned and saw the water's surface breaking in a line of disturbances, each one exactly 3 feet in diameter, perfectly circular. The wet rings were moving through the water, or something was making them, something beneath the surface, traveling upstream, leaving those circular disturbances in its wake. I didn't wait to see where they were going. I jumped into my boat, yanked the starter cord, and got the hell out of there. The engine roared to life. Normal sound, normal operation, everything working the way it should. I pointed the bow downstream and opened the throttle, putting as much distance between myself and Granite Creek as possible. The circular splashes followed for maybe a quarter mile, then gradually fell behind and disappeared. By the time I reached Kirkwood Creek Ranger Station, my hands had stopped shaking and I'd started to convince myself that I'd experienced some kind of psychological episode. Dehydration, maybe. Heat exhaustion. Too many days alone in the backcountry with nobody to talk to except myself. But I couldn't explain Ralph's missing boat. Couldn't explain the silent engine. Couldn't explain those perfect circular splashes moving upstream. I tried the radio as soon as I got to the station. Still no response from base. I checked the solar panels, the batteries, the connections. Everything seemed fine. But every time I keyed the mic, all I got was static. It was past 4 in the afternoon by then, and the sun was starting to sink toward the canyon rim. I had maybe 3 hours of daylight left. I needed to make a decision. Stay at Kirkwood and try to fix the radio, or head downstream to the nearest ranger station with working communications, which was at Pittsburgh Landing, about 15 miles away. I decided to stay. If Ralph was still out there somewhere, if he needed help, I couldn't abandon him just because I'd gotten spooked by some unexplained phenomena. And besides, in the rational part of my brain that was still functioning, I kept thinking there had to be a logical explanation. Gas pockets in the rocks making sounds. Temperature inversions causing weird acoustic effects. Some kind of groundwater seepage creating those wet circles. I told myself all of that and almost believed it, right up until sunset. That's when I saw the lights. They appeared on the canyon wall above Granite Creek, visible even from 8 miles away in the clear evening air. Pale blue lights, dozens of them, arranged in a grid pattern. Each light was circular, about 3 feet in diameter, and they pulsed in unison like a heartbeat, like the wet rings on the rocks. I watched them for maybe 20 minutes, trying to convince myself they were campfires or headlamps or some natural phenomenon I didn't understand. But campfires don't pulse in perfect synchronization, and headlamps don't float in midair, and no natural phenomenon I knew of produced that particular shade of blue. The lights began to move, not randomly but in a coordinated pattern, flowing across the canyon wall like water. And as they moved, I heard that breathing sound again, carried on the evening breeze, deep and rhythmic and profoundly wrong. Then my radio crackled to life, not with Barbara's voice, not with anyone's voice, just a sound, wet, gurgling, like someone trying to talk underwater. It went on for several seconds, then cut off abruptly. Then it started again, and this time I could make out something that might have been words, if words could be spoken by something that had never learned human speech. "Down," the radio gurgled. "Come down. Come see. Come home." The same message over and over in that wet, distorted voice. I turned off the radio and threw it across the room. I spent that night huddled in the ranger station with my Glock on the table and every light I could find burning. The blue lights on the canyon wall pulsed and moved until well after midnight, and several times I heard splashing sounds from the river, even though the snake was running calm and smooth. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces in the wet circles, watching me with their not-quite eyes. When dawn finally came, the lights were gone, and the canyon had returned to normal. Birds were singing. The river flowed its usual course. The temperature climbed back into the 80s, and everything seemed exactly as it should be. I turned the radio back on, took a deep breath, and tried to raise base. "Kirkwood Station to base, do you copy? Over." Barbara's voice came through immediately, clear as a bell. "Fiona, Jesus Christ, we've been trying to reach you all night. What the hell happened?" I gave her the sanitized version. Found Ralph's boat at Granite Creek, followed his tracks, Discovered some unusual water markings on the rocks. Lost radio contact. Spent an uncomfortable night at the station. I didn't mention the faces or the upward flowing water, or the silent engine or the lights on the canyon wall. Barbara listened, then was quiet for a long moment. Fiona, I need you to come back to headquarters, right now. Don't stop. Don't investigate anything else. Just get in your boat and come here. What about Ralph? We've got a team heading out to Granite Creek this morning. 3 rangers, all experienced with SAT phones and emergency beacons. You've done your part. Now I need you to come in and debrief. Barbara, what's going on? What aren't you telling me? Another pause. Just come in, Fiona, please. I packed up my gear and headed downstream. The boat ride to headquarters took about 4 hours, and the whole time I kept scanning the riverbanks, watching for circular splashes or blue lights or any other sign of the impossible things I'd seen the day before. But everything seemed normal, just another beautiful August day in Hell's Canyon, with rafters floating past and fishermen working the eddies and hawks circling overhead. The wilderness behaving exactly as wilderness should. Headquarters was located at Pittsburgh Landing, a relatively developed area with a boat ramp, a parking lot, and several Forest Service buildings. Barbara met me at the dock, and the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. Something was very wrong. She took me into her office, closed the door, and pulled down the blinds. Then she opened a file folder and slid several photographs across her desk. They showed wet rings on rocks. Dozens of them photographed over the course of many years in various locations throughout Hell's Canyon. Different rocks, different elevations, different seasons, but all identical in size and appearance. 3 feet in diameter, perfectly circular, soaking wet. These go back to 1983, Barbara said. Maybe earlier. That's just as far back as our photographic records go. Every few years, someone reports finding them. Always in remote areas, always near water, always in multiples. And almost every time there's a missing person involved. She slid another photo across the desk. It showed Ralph Kinman, but not the Ralph I knew. This Ralph looked older, thinner, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow. He was standing on a riverbank, soaking wet, staring at the camera with an expression I couldn't quite read. This was taken 2 hours ago, Barbara said. At Granite Creek. The SAR team found him wandering near where you found his boat yesterday. Is he okay? Physically, yes. Mentally, she shook her head. He's not talking, won't say a word about where he's been or what happened. Won't even acknowledge that any time has passed. As far as he's concerned, it's still yesterday afternoon, and he's still investigating that illegal camping report. Did you ask him about the wet rings? He says he never saw any. Says he hiked up Granite Creek, didn't find any sign of illegal camping, came back to his boat and... She stopped, choosing her words carefully. And that's where his memory gets fuzzy. He remembers getting in his boat. He remembers starting the engine. And the next thing he knows, it's 24 hours later, and he's standing on the gravel bar with our SAR team staring at him. I thought about those footprints walking into the river, disappearing into the deep water. He was underwater. Barbara looked at me sharply. Why do you say that? His tracks. I followed them into the Snake River. They didn't stop at the water's edge. They kept going, out into the deep channel. And when I found his boat gone, the rope was cut from the inside, like he'd deliberately set himself adrift. I paused. Or, like something had taken him. Fiona, I need you to be very clear about something. In your official report, you're going to say that you found evidence Ralph had been at Granite Creek, that you lost radio contact due to equipment malfunction, and that you returned to base when you couldn't locate him. That's it. No weird water markings, no strange lights, nothing that can't be easily explained. Why? Because every time someone reports these things, the wet rings, the lights, the sounds, they end up like Ralph, confused, with missing time, unable to account for what happened. And if we put that in an official report, if we document it in any way that could become public, we'd have to close large sections of the canyon. Do you know what that would mean? Economically, politically, people are disappearing, Barbara. And we're doing everything we can to find out why. But we have to be smart about it. We can't cause a panic, and we can't destroy the local economy over something we don't understand and can't prevent. I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that the truth mattered more than economics or politics. But I could see in Barbara's face that she was just as frustrated as I was, just as frightened by what was happening in the canyon, and just as powerless to do anything about it. "What happens now?" I asked. "Ralph is being taken to Boise for medical evaluation. The official story is heat exhaustion and dehydration causing temporary confusion. You're being reassigned to the Salmon River District for the remainder of the season, and Granite Creek is being temporarily closed for trail maintenance. And the thing that took him, the thing that made those wet rings and those lights?" Barbara closed the file folder. "We keep doing what we've always done. We monitor, we document, we hope it doesn't happen again." She looked at me with tired eyes. "And we pray it doesn't happen to us." I spent the next 3 weeks at the Salmon River District, trying to lose myself in routine work and failing miserably. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those faces in the wet circles. Every time I heard running water, I thought of that impossible stream flowing upward on the canyon wall. And every night I dreamed of Ralph's boot prints walking into the river, step by step, descending into darkness. Barbara called me once during that time, on my day off, speaking carefully like she knew someone might be listening. "Ralph's back home," she said. "Doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong with him. Mentally, he's coping. He requested an administrative leave and it was granted." "Is he talking about what happened?" "No, and Fiona, neither should you. I'm serious. This conversation never happened." She hung up before I could respond. I tried to let it go, tried to convince myself that Barbara was right, that some mysteries were better left alone, that my job was to protect the wilderness and the people who visited it, not to investigate every strange occurrence I couldn't explain. But I couldn't stop thinking about those photographs Barbara had shown me. Wet rings going back to 1983, possibly earlier. Decades of missing persons, of confused survivors, of Forest Service rangers like me being told to keep quiet and move on. So I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I started digging through old records. The Forest Service keeps detailed incident reports going back to the 1950s, when Hell's Canyon first came under federal management. Most of them are stored in a dusty archive room in the Boise headquarters building, filed away in bankers' boxes that nobody ever looks at. I requested access, claimed I was doing research for a wilderness safety training program, and spent my days off going through decades of yellowed paper. What I found made my blood run cold. The wet rings weren't just a recent phenomenon. They appeared in reports going back to 1959, described in slightly different terms, but clearly the same thing. Unusual water formations on rock surfaces, circular wet spots of unknown origin, unexplained moisture and drought conditions. And every single report that mentioned them also mentioned missing people. In 1959, a geology student from the University of Idaho disappeared near Granite Creek. His camera was found on a riverbank, the last photo showing a wet circle on a boulder. In 1964, 2 fishermen went missing near the same location. Their boat was found drifting downstream, empty except for their tackle boxes and a Polaroid camera. The film had been exposed to light and destroyed, except for one frame that showed what looked like blue lights on a canyon wall. In 1971, a Forest Service ranger named Thomas Brighton reported finding circular water markings of unknown origin while investigating a missing hiker case. Brighton's report noted that the hiker was never found, but his boots and backpack were discovered on the riverbank, arranged in a neat pile as if deliberately placed there. Brighton himself went missing 3 weeks later. His body was never recovered. The pattern continued through the 70s, 80s, 90s, right up to the present day. Every few years, someone would see the wet rings. Every time, someone would disappear or return with missing time and no memory. And every time, the Forest Service would file a quiet report, document the incident, and move on. But there was one report that stood out from all the others. It was dated June 15, 1997, written by a ranger named Elizabeth Carver. Unlike the others, Carver's report wasn't sanitized or carefully worded. It was raw, almost frantic, like she'd written it in a hurry and never expected anyone to read it. She described finding wet rings at Granite Creek, the same location where I'd found them, where Ralph had disappeared. She described following them up the canyon wall and seeing something she called the convergence point. And then her report took a strange turn. The water flows in 2 directions simultaneously, she wrote, up and down, forward and backward. The river remembers every drop that ever passed through it, and at the convergence point, all those memories become present. The wet rings are marks left by people who stepped out of time's normal flow, not into the future or the past, but into the eternal present where the river exists all at once. The report continued. I believe the Snake River, in this location, has worn through more than just rock. It's worn through the fabric of reality itself, creating a place where the normal rules don't apply. The blue lights are emissions from this breach, pressure waves in space-time made visible. The sounds are echoes of every sound the canyon has ever held, playing simultaneously. Her final paragraph read, I'm going back to study the convergence point more carefully. If I'm right, this is the most significant geological temporal anomaly ever discovered. If I'm wrong, then I'm losing my mind. Either way, I need to know. Elizabeth Carver never filed another report. She was listed as missing on June 17, 1997, 2 days after writing those words. Her boat was found at Granite Creek, her gear neatly stacked on the gravel bar. Searchers found boot prints leading into the river, disappearing into the deep channel. Just like Ralph's prints. Just like the ones from dozens of other cases stretching back decades. I photocopied Carver's report and smuggled it out of the archive. That night, in my apartment in Boise, I read it over and over, trying to understand what she'd been describing. A convergence point where the river existed in all times at once. A breach in reality worn away by millions of years of flowing water. It sounded insane. It was insane, but it was the only explanation that fit everything I'd seen. The water flowing upward, the faces in the wet circles, Ralph's missing 24 hours. The voices speaking through my radio. The Snake River had carved Hell's Canyon so deep that it had cut through to somewhere else. Somewhere outside normal time and space. And occasionally, under the right conditions, that elsewhere touched our world. The wet rings were the boundary markers, 3-foot circles where the 2 realities overlapped. And people who crossed that boundary fell out of our timeline into the river's eternal present, where every moment that ever was, or would be, existed simultaneously. I sat there with Carver's photocopied report in my hands, and I realized I had a choice. I could do what Barbara had told me to do. File my sanitized report, forget what I'd seen, move on with my career. Or I could do what Elizabeth Carver had done. Go back to Granite Creek and try to understand. The smart choice was obvious. The safe choice was obvious. But I'd never been good at making the safe choice. I requested a week of personal leave and drove back to Hell's Canyon. Not to Kirkwood Station or any official Forest Service location. I knew Barbara would have rangers watching for me. Instead, I parked at a public boat launch 15 miles downstream from Granite Creek and hiked in along the river trail. It took me 2 days to reach the location where I'd found Ralph's boat. The trail maintenance closure was still in effect, marked by yellow tape and warning signs, but there were no rangers actually stationed there. I ducked under the tape and headed up Granite Creek drainage. The wet rings were still there. Not the same ones I'd seen in August. These were in different locations, different rocks, but they were identical in every other way. 3 feet in diameter, soaking wet, cold to the touch, smelling of minerals. I followed them up the canyon wall, climbing higher and higher, until I reached the spot where I'd seen the water flowing upward. The rock face was dry now, no sign of that impossible cascade. But there was something else, a narrow opening in the cliff, partially hidden by a rockfall that I hadn't noticed before. A cave, or not quite a cave. More like a crack in the canyon wall, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. I turned on my headlamp and eased myself into the opening. It was tight, claustrophobic, and for a moment I considered turning back, but I could hear water ahead, echoing off stone, and I knew I had to see what was on the other side. The crack opened into a cavern, maybe 20 feet across and 30 feet high, and every surface, floor, walls, ceiling, was covered in wet rings. Hundreds of them, thousands maybe, 3-foot circles overlapping and intersecting, creating patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly. And in the center of each ring I could see something moving. Not faces this time, but scenes, moments, fragments of time. I saw the geology student from 1959, young and excited, photographing a wet ring on a boulder. I saw the fisherman from 1964, pointing at lights on the canyon wall. I saw Thomas Brighton, the ranger who went missing in 1971, walking into this same cavern with wonder on his face. I saw Elizabeth Carver, standing exactly where I was standing, scribbling frantically in a notebook. And I saw Ralph, dozens of Ralphs actually. Ralph at different ages, in different seasons, wearing different clothes. Ralph, as he was now, investigating the illegal camping report. Ralph, as he'd been years ago, when he was still a fishing guide. Ralph, as he would be in the future, old and gray, but still wearing a ranger's uniform. All of them existed simultaneously in those wet circles, trapped in the river's eternal present. The water sound grew louder, and I looked up to see the stream flowing across the ceiling. Not dripping down, flowing across the rock surface like it was a floor, defying gravity, forming and reforming those circular patterns. And as I watched, I began to understand what Elizabeth Carver had tried to describe in her report. The water wasn't just water. It was time itself, made visible and tangible. The Snake River had flowed through this canyon for so long, with such force, that it had worn away more than just stone. It had worn away the barrier between moments, creating a place where past, present, and future existed in the same space. The wet rings were pools of time. Standing water from the river of moments. And if you touched them, if you stepped into them, you fell out of the normal flow. You became like the river itself, eternal, unchanging, existing in all times at once. It was beautiful, terrible, but beautiful. I understood why Elizabeth Carver had kept coming back, why Thomas Brighton had walked willingly into this space. Why people over decades had heard the call and followed it into the deep water. Because once you understood what this place was, once you saw the river of time flowing in its true form, the temptation to step into it was almost overwhelming. I could see my own life in those circles. Not just my past, my childhood in Oregon, my years at university, my first day as a Forest Service ranger, but also my future. I saw myself older, retired, sitting on a porch somewhere with grandchildren I didn't have yet. I saw myself in a hospital bed, ancient and frail. I saw my death, peaceful and quiet, decades from now. And I saw all the other futures I might have had. The ones where I made different choices, took different paths, became different versions of Fiona Merryweather. All of them existing simultaneously in the river's eternal present. The water was calling to me. The same voice I'd heard through my radio that night at Kirkwood Station, but clearer now, more articulate. Come down, come see, come home, come join the river and know everything, be everything, exist in all moments at once. I took a step forward. The water was right there, flowing across the cavern floor, inviting me to step into its current and become part of the eternal present. And then I thought of Barbara's face when she told me to file the sanitized report. I thought of Ralph, gaunt and hollow-eyed, unable to remember where he'd been. I thought of the 73 missing people whose names I'd read in those old reports, all of them now existing in fragments of time, unable to move forward, unable to die, unable to do anything except exist. I thought of Elizabeth Carver, whose brilliant mind had figured out what this place was, and who'd made the choice to step into the river anyway. And I thought, no. I backed away from the water. The voices grew louder, more insistent. But I kept backing up, step by step, until I reached the crack in the cave wall. I squeezed through sideways, scraping my shoulders and arms, and emerged back into normal sunlight, normal gravity, normal time where moments followed one after another in the proper sequence. I hiked back down to the river and kept hiking until I was miles away from Granite Creek. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, and I didn't feel safe until I was out of Hell's Canyon entirely, driving north on Highway 95 with the canyon walls shrinking in my rearview mirror. That was 12 years ago. I never went back to Hell's Canyon. I requested a transfer to desk work, accepted a position coordinating wilderness safety programs, and spent the next decade trying to forget what I'd seen in that cavern. But I never could forget. Not completely. Because I know the truth now. I know why people disappear in Hell's Canyon, why they leave their gear neatly stacked, why they walk into the river without hesitation. I know why Ralph came back with missing time and Elizabeth Carver never came back at all. They saw the river of time. They understood what it was, and they had to choose. Most people choose to stay in the normal world, where time flows in one direction and moments disappear into the past as new moments arrive. It's limiting, yes. It means we can't revisit our best memories or skip our worst ones. It means we age and die and eventually cease to exist. But it also means we're free. Free to change, to grow, to become different people than we were yesterday. The river of time carries us forward whether we want to go or not, and that's terrifying sometimes. But it's also what makes us human. The people who step into the wet rings, who accept the river's invitation to exist in all moments at once, they give up that freedom. They become eternal, unchanging, trapped in the present moment forever. They can see everything, experience everything, but they can't move forward, can't grow, can't die. I don't know if that's better or worse than our normal existence. Maybe for some people it's exactly what they want. Maybe for Elizabeth Carver and Thomas Brighton and all the others, the chance to know everything was worth the price of giving up their futures. But it wasn't worth it for me. I wanted to keep moving forward, even if that meant growing old and forgetting and eventually dying. I wanted to remain in time's flow, not step out of it. So I left. I filed my sanitized report just like Barbara had asked. I never told anyone what I'd seen in that cavern. Never showed anyone Elizabeth Carver's photocopied report. Never tried to warn people away from Granite Creek beyond the official trail closure signs. Because here's what I learned. You can't stop people from seeking the river of time if that's what they truly want. The canyon has been wearing away at reality for millions of years, and it'll keep wearing for millions more. The wet rings will keep appearing. The blue lights will keep calling, and some people will always answer that call. All you can do is make your own choice and live with it. I made mine. I chose the normal world, with all its limitations and pain and eventual death. I chose to keep moving forward through time instead of stepping out of it. And you know what? I don't regret it. Not even on the days when I wake up from dreams of that cavern, when I see wet circles on rocks and my heart starts racing, when I hear water flowing and wonder if it's running in the right direction. Because I'm still here, still moving forward, still growing and changing and becoming new versions of myself with each passing moment, still alive in the truest sense of the word. The people in the wet rings, Ralph during his missing 24 hours, Elizabeth Carver, Thomas Brighton, all the others, they're not dead exactly. But they're not alive either. They're just there, existing in the eternal present, aware but unchanging, knowing everything but experiencing nothing. I tell this story not as a warning exactly. If you're drawn to Granite Creek, if you hear the river calling, if you find yourself standing in front of a wet ring wondering what would happen if you stepped into it, well, that's your choice to make. I can't stop you, and I won't judge you. But I hope you'll think carefully before you decide. Because once you step into the river of time, you can't step back out. Once you exist in all moments at once, you can't return to the normal flow. And as strange and limiting and painful as normal life can be, it's the only life that actually moves forward. My name is Morgan Shadley, and I worked as a trail maintenance ranger for the Bureau of Land Management in Hell's Canyon for 9 years. When people ask me why I left, I tell them the work got too repetitive. Same trails, same problems, same solutions, year after year. That's true enough, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I stopped trusting the ground beneath my feet. I stopped believing that trails led where they said they led, that markers pointed in the directions they claimed to point, that the canyon itself was a fixed and knowable place. And once you stop trusting those fundamental things, you can't do trail maintenance anymore. You definitely can't do it in Hell's Canyon. Let me back up and give you some context. Trail maintenance in a place like Hell's Canyon isn't like maintaining trails in a national park. We don't have wooden signs with helpful arrows or paved pathways with painted lines. Most of our trails are just routes that have been walked often enough to stay visible. A line of compressed dirt through the sagebrush, a series of cairns across a rock field, blazes cut into tree bark where the forest gets thick enough to have trees. My job was to keep those markers visible and accurate. I'd hike each trail in my assigned sector twice a year, once in spring after the snow melt, once in fall before winter closed things down. I'd repaint faded blazes, rebuild collapsed cairns, clear fallen trees, and update the GPS coordinates in our database. Simple work, mostly. Solitary work, which suited me fine. I'd been doing it without incident for 8 years. And then came October of 2013. I was assigned to maintain the High Ridge Trail, which runs along the eastern rim of the canyon for about 12 miles before dropping down to the Snake River. It's a challenging trail, steep in places, exposed to weather, with some sections that require scrambling over loose rock. but it's also popular with experienced hikers because the views are spectacular. The trail is marked every quarter mile with blazes, orange paint stripes on trees or rocks, each one about 6 inches tall and 3 inches wide. Standard Forest Service markers, the kind you see on trails all over the country. They're designed to be visible from a distance and to last for years without needing maintenance. I started my inspection on October 7th, hiking up from the trailhead at Temperance Creek with my GPS unit, my trail marking kit, and enough supplies for 3 days. The weather was perfect. Clear skies, temperatures in the 60s, just enough wind to keep the mosquitoes down. I was in good spirits, looking forward to a few days of solitude in some of the most beautiful country I'd ever seen. The first few miles of trail were in good condition. The markers were visible, the path was clear, and my GPS coordinates matched the database perfectly. I made some notes about spots that would need attention in the spring. A few loose rocks that could become dangerous if they shifted, a dead tree that might fall across the trail during winter storms, but nothing that required immediate action. Around mile 4, I stopped for lunch at a scenic overlook. You could see the Snake River from there, winding through the canyon 1,000 feet below, the water looking almost black in the afternoon shadows. I ate my sandwich, updated my log, and checked my GPS. That's when I noticed something odd. According to my GPS, I was at mile 4.2 on the High Ridge Trail, but according to the trail markers I'd been following, I should have been at mile 4.8, a discrepancy of just over half a mile. That shouldn't have been possible. I'd personally updated this trail's GPS coordinates the previous spring, and I'd been counting markers as I went, but the GPS doesn't lie, or at least, it's not supposed to. I figured maybe I'd miscounted the blazes or missed one hidden by vegetation. I kept hiking, paying closer attention to the markers. At what should have been mile 5, I found a blaze on a ponderosa pine. Fresh paint, bright orange, exactly where it should be. I marked the GPS coordinates and continued. Mile 5.25, another blaze, this one on a boulder. Coordinates recorded. Mile 5.5, blaze on a dead snag. Coordinates recorded. But when I checked my GPS, it showed that I'd only traveled 4.6 miles from the trailhead. The discrepancy was growing. According to the trail markers, I should have been at mile 5.5. According to the GPS, I was barely past mile 4.5. I stopped and recalibrated the GPS unit. Turned it off, turned it back on, waited for it to acquire satellites. Same reading, 4.6 miles from the trailhead. I pulled out my paper map and tried to triangulate my position using visible landmarks. To the north, I could see the distinctive peak of Hat Point. To the south, the river made a sharp bend around a promontory called Eagle's Nest. Based on those landmarks, I should have been at approximately mile 5.5. The trail markers agreed with the landmarks. The GPS disagreed with everything. I made a note in my log and kept hiking. Maybe the GPS was malfunctioning. Canyon walls can interfere with satellite signals, creating errors in positioning. It was annoying, but not unprecedented. By late afternoon, I'd reached the spot where I'd planned to camp. A flat area about 50 yards off the main trail, sheltered by a cluster of pines, with easy access to a seasonal creek that should still have had water in October. According to my trail markers, I was at mile 8. According to my GPS, I was at mile 5.2, a discrepancy of nearly 3 miles. I set up my tent, filtered some water, and spent the evening trying to figure out what was wrong with my GPS. I replaced the batteries. I reset the unit to factory defaults. I manually entered coordinates for my current position based on landmark triangulation. Nothing helped. Every time I checked, the GPS insisted I was at mile 5.2, even though I could clearly see trail markers that indicated otherwise. I finally gave up and decided to rely on the trail markers themselves. They'd been there for years, maintained by multiple rangers before me. They were physical, verifiable, consistent. The GPS was just malfunctioning electronics. That night, I slept poorly. Not because of the GPS problem, that was annoying, but not alarming. I slept poorly because of the sounds. Hell's Canyon is never truly silent at night. You've got owls, coyotes, the occasional elk bugling, wind through the pines, and the distant whisper of the Snake River. But these sounds were different, rhythmic, almost mechanical, like someone hammering stakes into the ground, over and over at regular intervals. I lay in my tent listening to that sound for maybe an hour. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the main trail, maybe 100 yards away. I considered investigating, but it was fully dark by then, and wandering around an unfamiliar area without good light seemed like a bad idea. The hammering continued until well after midnight, then stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I heard something else. Footsteps. Not the tentative steps of an animal, but the confident stride of a human walking the trail. Back and forth, like someone pacing. I called out, "Hello? Anyone out there?" The footsteps stopped. Then, after a pause, they resumed. Same pace, same rhythm, back and forth along the trail. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped my tent. "I'm a BLM ranger. If you need assistance, please identify yourself." The footsteps continued for another few seconds, then stopped again. This time, they didn't resume. I waited for maybe 5 minutes, listening, but heard nothing except the normal nighttime sounds of the canyon. I slept with my flashlight in my hand after that, and every small sound jerked me halfway awake. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted and irritable, ready to finish this trail inspection and get back to civilization. I broke camp, filtered more water, and headed back to the main trail. That's when I saw what had changed overnight. The trail markers were gone. Not all of them, just the ones ahead of me, the ones that should have guided me through the remaining 4 miles of trail. I walked to where the next blaze should have been, a distinctive lightning-struck pine that I'd seen the previous afternoon. The tree was there, but the orange paint was gone. Not faded, not weathered, just gone. The bark was smooth and unmarked, as if no one had ever touched it. I moved to the next marker location, a large boulder with a flat face perfect for painting. No orange blaze. The rock was there exactly where it should be, but unmarked. I spent an hour hiking forward, checking every spot where I remembered seeing a marker the previous day. All of them were gone. Trees that had been blazed were now bare. Rocks that had been painted were now clean. It was as if someone had come through during the night and removed every single trail marker ahead of my position. But that was impossible. Trail markers aren't stickers you can peel off. They're paint applied directly to the surface, designed to last for years. You'd need paint remover and serious effort to get rid of them, and even then you'd leave marks, scuff marks, discoloration, something. These surfaces looked like they'd never been marked at all. I checked behind me, back toward the trailhead. Those markers were still there, exactly as they should be. But ahead of me, the trail had become unmarked wilderness. I pulled out my GPS to check my position. It still read 5.2 miles from the trailhead, exactly the same as the previous evening. I hiked forward 50 yards, deliberately putting distance between myself and where I'd camped. Checked the GPS again, 5.2 miles from the trailhead. I hiked forward another 100 yards. GPS 5.2 miles. I hiked forward 200 yards, scrambling over rocks and pushing through brush. GPS 5.2 miles. The position wasn't updating. I was moving, I could feel my legs working, could see the landscape changing around me. but according to the GPS, I was standing still. Or rather, I was standing at exactly the same point, no matter how far I walked. I stopped and took several deep breaths, trying to calm the panic that was starting to build in my chest. This couldn't be happening. GPS units malfunction sometimes, sure, but they don't show you standing still when you're clearly moving. And trail markers don't disappear overnight. There had to be a rational explanation. There had to be. I pulled out my radio and tried to call base. BLM Ranger Shadley to Pittsburgh Landing. Do you copy? Static. I adjusted the frequency and tried again. More static. Not unusual. The canyon walls interfered with radio signals all the time. But I should have been high enough on the ridge to get at least a weak signal. I tried my cell phone, even though I knew there was no service in the canyon. No signal, as expected. I tried my emergency satellite beacon, which should have worked anywhere on Earth with a clear view of the sky. The light blinked, indicating it was trying to connect, but no confirmation message appeared. I was alone on a trail that was disappearing, carrying GPS equipment that insisted I wasn't moving, with no way to call for help. The smart thing to do would have been to turn around and hike back to the trailhead. The markers behind me were still intact, and I could navigate by them. Even if the GPS was malfunctioning, I knew the way back, but I didn't turn around. I don't know if it was stubbornness or professional pride or just sheer curiosity, but I wanted to understand what was happening. I wanted to find those missing markers, wanted to figure out why my GPS was stuck, wanted to solve this problem before reporting it. So I kept hiking forward into the unmarked wilderness. About a mile ahead, or what I estimated was a mile since my GPS wasn't updating, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was a trail marker, a fresh orange blaze on a granite outcropping, the paint still glossy, clearly applied within the last day or two. But it was pointing in the wrong direction. Instead of indicating the trail continued ahead, this marker's stripe was oriented perpendicular to the trail, pointing directly toward the canyon rim. I walked over to examine it more closely. The paint was standard trail marking paint, the kind I carried in my own kit. The technique was correct. Proper brush strokes, proper size, proper placement. This had been done by someone who knew what they were doing. But why point the marker off the trail? Toward a section of canyon rim that was exposed, dangerous, with loose rock and a sheer drop-off just beyond. I looked in the direction the marker indicated and saw something that made my stomach drop. Another marker, maybe 50 yards away, on a standing dead tree. Also pointing perpendicular to the actual trail, pointing toward the rim. A line of markers, each one visible from the previous one, creating a new trail. A trail that led toward a cliff edge where no trail should go. I should have turned back then. Every instinct I had was screaming that this was wrong, that I was in danger, that I needed to get out of this place immediately. But I didn't turn back, because I'd noticed something about that second marker, the one on the dead tree. I recognized my own brush technique. The way the top edge of the stripe was slightly rounded, a habit I'd developed over years of marking trails. The way the paint was layered just a little thicker on the left side. I had painted that marker. I was certain of it. But I had no memory of doing so. I stood there, staring at that marker. My marker, painted with my technique, but existing in my memory as a void, and tried to think rationally about what was happening. There had to be an explanation. Memory gaps can happen. I'd been tired. Maybe I'd painted some markers and forgotten. Maybe I'd sleepwalked. Maybe the stress of the GPS malfunction had triggered some kind of fugue state. But I didn't believe any of that. I knew my own habits, my own procedures. I documented every marker I painted, every repair I made. And I hadn't painted anything the previous evening. I'd been too focused on troubleshooting the GPS. I walked toward the false trail, following the line of misplaced markers. 5 of them, each one perfectly positioned to be visible from the previous one, each one pointing steadily toward the canyon rim. I stopped about 20 feet from the edge, where the ground became loose scree and the drop-off began. From this vantage point, I could see the full depth of Hell's Canyon spread out below. The Snake River was a dark ribbon winding through the gorge, and the opposite wall rose in layers of basalt and granite, climbing toward the horizon. Beautiful country. Deadly country, if you fell. I looked down at the ground near my feet and saw boot prints, fresh ones, pressed into the soft dirt. The tread pattern was familiar, Vask hiking boots, the same model I wore. My size, my stride length. The prints led from where I was standing back toward my camp, then forward again to the rim's edge. I'd walked this route before, recently, but I had no memory of it. The fear I'd been holding at bay finally crashed over me in full force. Something was very wrong here. Something was wrong with my memory, wrong with the trail, wrong with the canyon itself. I needed to get out, needed to get back to civilization, needed to report this to someone who could make sense of it. I turned and started hiking back toward my camp, moving fast, not quite running but close. Behind me, I heard a sound that made me stop. Hammering. The same rhythmic noise I'd heard during the night, but now coming from ahead of me, from the direction of the legitimate trail. I approached cautiously, my hand on the can of bear spray clipped to my belt. The hammering continued, steady and mechanical, and as I got closer I could see someone working near the trail. A man in a Forest Service uniform, kneeling next to a tree, driving a metal stake into the ground with a small sledgehammer. "Hey!" I called out. "Ranger!" The man looked up and I felt a rush of relief. It was Eli Torrance, another trail maintenance ranger I'd worked with before. We weren't close friends, but we knew each other. Had shared beers at the Riggins Tavern a few times. He was reliable, experienced, someone I could trust. "Morgan?" He stood up, brushing dirt off his knees. "What are you doing up here? I thought this was your solo inspection week." "It is? What are you doing here?" "Got a report that some markers had gone missing on the High Ridge Trail. They sent me up to replace them." He gestured at the metal stake he'd been hammering. "Thought I'd switch to these new trail markers. Metal posts instead of painted blazes. More durable, harder to remove or vandalize." I walked closer and saw that he'd already installed several of the metal markers, each one a thin post about 4 feet high with a reflective orange band near the top. They were lined up along the trail, evenly spaced, pointing in the correct direction. "When did you get the report?" I asked. "Yesterday afternoon. Base radioed me around 3, said hikers had complained about missing markers. Asked if I could come up and fix it." "Yesterday afternoon." "Eli, I was on this trail yesterday afternoon. The markers were there, all of them." He looked at me with concern. "You okay, Morgan? You look pretty stressed." "The markers disappeared last night, overnight. I camped at Mile 8 and when I woke up, everything ahead of me was unmarked." "Mile 8, Morgan, you're at mile 5.2, right here." He pulled out his own GPS unit and showed me the screen. "See? We're both at the exact same coordinates." I looked at his GPS, then at mine. They showed identical readings, 5.2 miles from the trailhead. But that was impossible. I'd hiked at least 3 miles since breaking camp that morning. "Something's wrong with the GPS," I said. "Mine's been stuck at that reading since yesterday evening. Won't update no matter how far I walk." Eli frowned. "That's weird. Let me check mine." He walked 50 yards down the trail, then checked his unit. "Yep, it updated fine. I'm at 5.3 now." He walked back toward me. 5.2 again. "GPS is working fine, Morgan. Maybe yours just needs a firmware update or something." I wanted to argue. Wanted to insist that I'd definitely hiked more than 5.2 miles, that I'd camped at mile 8, that the markers had been there and then vanished. But Eli's GPS was working normally. His markers were in place, and I was starting to doubt my own perception of events. "Did you hear anything weird last night?" I asked. "Hammering sounds? Footsteps?" "I wasn't here last night, just hiked up this morning. Got here maybe an hour ago." He studied my face. "Morgan, seriously, are you feeling okay? You look exhausted. When's the last time you slept?" "I slept last night, sort of. There were these sounds." I stopped, hearing how paranoid I sounded. "Never mind, maybe I'm just tired." "Tell you what," Eli said. "Why don't you head back to the trailhead, get some real rest? I'll finish marking this section. We can do the inspection together next time if you want backup." It was a reasonable suggestion. More than reasonable, it was exactly what I should do. Get out of the canyon, get some sleep, come back when I was thinking clearly. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, not wanting to admit I couldn't handle a simple trail inspection. Maybe it was stubbornness, refusing to leave a job half-finished. Or maybe it was something else, some instinct warning me that if I left now, I'd never understand what had happened. "I'm fine," I said. "Let me help you with the markers. 2 of us will get it done faster." Eli looked uncertain, but finally nodded. "All right, I've got extra stakes in my pack. You want to work ahead of me while I finish this section?" He handed me a bundle of metal stakes and a small sledgehammer. The stakes were lightweight but sturdy, each one with a pointed end for driving into the ground and a reflective band that would be visible even in low light. Standard gear, nothing unusual about them. I walked ahead to where the trail continued around a bend and started installing stakes every quarter mile. The work was straightforward, almost meditative. Find a good spot with stable ground, position the stake, hammer it in until the base was solid. I'd done similar work hundreds of times. But as I hammered in the 3rd stake, I noticed something odd. The hole I'd just made in the ground, there was another hole right next to it, partially filled with dirt. The same size, the same depth, as if someone had driven a stake there recently and then removed it. I checked the spot where I'd installed the 2nd stake. Same thing, a filled-in hole right next to where I'd placed the new marker. I walked back to the 1st stake I'd installed and found another old hole nearby, this one with fragments of metal still visible in the packed dirt. I dug them out with my fingers, pieces of a broken stake, identical to the ones I was installing. The metal was bent and twisted, as if it had been pulled out forcibly. Someone had already installed these markers. Then someone had removed them, and now I was installing them again, in exactly the same spots. I walked back to where Eli was working. "Eli, were you up here before? Earlier in the week, maybe?" "Nope. First time on this trail this season." "Someone installed these markers already. I found holes and broken stakes." He looked up from his work. "That doesn't make sense. These are new markers. First time we're using them on this trail. Come look." I led him to the spot where I'd found the most obvious evidence. He examined the filled-in hole and the broken metal fragments, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "That's weird," he admitted. "But maybe they're from an old trail marking project, before we switched to paint. These stakes are the same as what we're using now. Same design, same reflective bands. Okay, that is strange." He pulled out his radio. "Let me check with base, see if anyone else has been up here." He keyed the mic. "Ranger Torrance to Pittsburgh Landing. Do you copy?" Static. He adjusted the frequency and tried again. Still static. "Radio's not working," he said. "Probably the canyon walls. We're in a bad spot for signal." "My radio didn't work either," I said. Neither did my satellite beacon. Eli tried his satellite beacon. Like mine, it blinked but never confirmed connection. He tried his cell phone. No service. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw real concern in his eyes. "This is getting weird," he said. "It's been weird since yesterday." We stood there for a moment, both of us trying to make sense of a situation that made no sense. Then Eli made a decision. "We should head back to the trailhead," he said. "Something's not right here. The missing markers, the communication problems, the GPS glitches. This isn't normal. We need to report it." I nodded, relieved that someone else was finally confirming what I'd been feeling. We weren't crazy. Something was genuinely wrong with this section of trail. We gathered our gear and started hiking back toward Temperance Creek. Eli led the way, following his metal stakes back down the trail. I counted them as we passed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The same markers we'd just installed. After the 5th marker, Eli stopped. "That's odd." "What?" "That marker ahead. I didn't install that one." I looked where he was pointing and saw one of his metal stakes, identical to the others, positioned at the correct quarter-mile interval. But Eli had only installed 5 markers. This would be the 6th. "Maybe you miscounted," I suggested. "I didn't miscount. I know exactly how many I put in." He walked up to the marker and examined it. "This one's been here longer. See how the dirt's more compacted around the base? This was installed days ago, maybe weeks." We kept hiking, and the markers continued. 6, 7, 8, 9. All of them identical to what Eli had been installing. All of them positioned exactly where they should be. All of them showing varying degrees of age. Some were fresh, dirt still loose around the base. Others looked like they'd been there for weeks. "We're walking in circles," Eli said quietly. "What?" "Look at that tree." He pointed to a distinctive lightning-struck pine, its trunk charred black on one side. "We passed that 10 minutes ago." I looked at my GPS. Still 5.2 miles from the trailhead. I walked 20 paces back up the trail, then checked again. 5.2 miles. 20 paces forward. 5.2 miles. "The trail's looping," Eli said. "We're walking forward, but somehow ending up in the same place. That's why your GPS isn't updating, because you're not actually moving away from this point. That's impossible." "I know it's impossible, but it's happening." We tried walking faster, nearly jogging down the trail. We passed the lightning-struck pine 3 more times. Each time, Eli's GPS showed the same coordinates. Each time we were back at 5.2 miles from the trailhead. We tried leaving the trail, bushwhacking through the scrub and rock, heading directly toward where the trailhead should be. After 20 minutes of hard hiking, we emerged back onto the trail at exactly the same spot, passing the same lightning-struck pine. We tried hiking toward the canyon rim, toward the false trail I'd found that morning. We couldn't reach it. Every time we got close, the terrain somehow shifted, and we'd find ourselves back at the main trail, back at 5.2 miles. The sun was setting by the time we admitted defeat. We were trapped in a loop, unable to move forward or backward, unable to leave the trail, unable to reach any destination except the single point where our GPS units agreed we existed. Eli set up his tent 50 yards from mine, in the same sheltered area where I'd camped the previous night. We built a fire, against regulations, but neither of us cared at that point, and sat staring at the flames trying to understand what was happening to us. "Someone's playing a trick," Eli said. "Has to be. Some kind of elaborate prank." "Who would do that? How would they do it?" "I don't know. But it's the only explanation that makes sense." "Does it?" because I don't see how anyone could make GPS units malfunction like this or make trails loop back on themselves, or... I stopped, listening. The hammering sound had started again, rhythmic and mechanical, coming from the direction of the main trail. Eli heard it too. "Is that what you heard last night?" "Yeah." We grabbed our flashlights and headed toward the sound. It was fully dark by then, and our beams cut narrow tunnels through the blackness. The hammering continued, steady and precise, and as we got closer we could see something moving on the trail. A figure, human-shaped, kneeling next to a tree, driving something into the ground with methodical strikes. It was wearing a Forest Service uniform and using the same small sledgehammer Eli had been using earlier. "Hey!" Eli called out. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond, didn't even pause in its work. Hammer, 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 steady as a metronome. We approached slowly, and as our flashlight beams reached the figure, I felt my stomach drop. It was Eli, not someone who looked like Eli, not a stranger in similar clothing. It was Eli himself, kneeling next to a tree, installing one of the metal trail markers we'd spent the afternoon placing. The same uniform, the same boots, the same pack leaning against a nearby boulder. I looked at the real Eli standing next to me, then back at the figure hammering stakes. Both of them were solid, real, casting proper shadows in our flashlight beams. The other Eli finished hammering, stood up, gathered his tools, and walked further down the trail. He passed within 10 feet of us, his face clearly visible in our lights. His expression was blank, focused, like someone performing a routine task without really thinking about it. He didn't see us. Or if he did, he didn't react. We followed him for maybe 50 yards. He stopped at another spot, knelt down, pulled out another stake, and started hammering. Same rhythm, same mechanical precision. "Is that me?" Eli asked. "Yeah." "How is that me?" "I don't know." We watched the other Eli work for several minutes. Then, suddenly, he stopped mid-swing. He dropped the hammer, stood up, and walked directly toward the canyon rim. Not following the trail, not watching his footing, just walking in a straight line toward the edge. "Hey!" the real Eli shouted. "Stop!" The other Eli didn't stop. He walked right up to the edge, where loose scree and gravity took over, and fell. We ran to the rim, expecting to hear a scream, a crash, something. But there was no sound. We aimed our flashlights down into the canyon, but the beams didn't reach far enough to illuminate the bottom. If the other Eli had fallen, if he'd hit the rocks 1,000 feet below, we couldn't see it. "What the hell is happening?" Eli asked, his voice shaking. I didn't have an answer, but I was starting to suspect that we weren't just trapped in a loop on the trail. We were trapped in something bigger, something the canyon had created or captured or become. A loop not just in space, but in time, where actions repeated endlessly, where versions of ourselves existed simultaneously, carrying out the same tasks over and over without ever finishing, without ever moving forward. The hammering started again, back where we'd first seen the other Eli. When we returned to that spot, he was there, whole and uninjured, kneeling next to the same tree, driving in the same stake, as if the fall had never happened. We didn't sleep that night. We sat by the fire and watched the duplicate Eli hammer stakes for hours. He'd work for maybe 20 minutes, walk toward the canyon rim, fall, and then reappear back at the tree, starting the same sequence over again. An endless loop, as predictable as a recording on repeat. "How long has he been doing that?" Eli asked at one point. "I don't know, since yesterday at least, maybe longer." "How long are we going to be doing it?" I didn't answer that question, because I didn't want to say out loud what we were both thinking. Maybe forever. Maybe we were already stuck in our own loops, our own versions of hammering stakes and walking to cliff edges, and we just hadn't noticed yet. Around 2 a.m., Eli's duplicate finally stopped resetting. He drove in one final stake, gathered his tools, and walked back down the trail toward where we were sitting. This time, instead of passing us by, he walked directly to Eli's tent and went inside. We heard rustling as he settled into his sleeping bag. Then silence. "Should we check on him?" Eli whispered. "No. Don't touch him. Don't interact with him. I don't think we want to know what happens if we do." We sat in silence for a while longer. Then Eli said, "I need to tell you something about why they really sent me up here. The missing markers weren't real." "Oh, they were real. But that's not why I came. They sent me up here to check on you." I looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Base got a weird report 2 days ago. Hiker said he met a ranger on the High Ridge Trail who seemed confused, disoriented. Said the ranger was installing trail markers that pointed in random directions, and when the hiker asked if they needed help, the ranger just walked away. Didn't respond, didn't acknowledge the question." My stomach tightened. "What did the ranger look like?" "Female, about your height and build, dark hair, wearing a BLM uniform." He paused. "The description matched you exactly, Morgan." I wasn't confused or disoriented, and I certainly wasn't installing random markers. "I know. I believe you. But that's why they sent me up here. To do a welfare check, make sure you were okay. The missing markers thing was just the official story." I thought about the false trail I'd found that morning, the markers pointing toward the cliff edge, the ones painted with my technique, in my style, that I had no memory of creating. "What if I was?" I said quietly. "What if some version of me is out there, stuck in a loop, installing those markers over and over? What if the me sitting here talking to you right now isn't the real me?" "Don't think like that." "Why not? Your duplicate is sleeping in your tent right now. Who's to say we're any more real than he is?" Eli didn't have an answer to that. We stayed awake until dawn, feeding the fire, watching the stars wheel overhead. The canyon was absolutely silent except for the crackling wood and the distant whisper of the Snake River. No more hammering, no more footsteps. Just 2 rangers sitting by a fire, trapped in a loop they couldn't escape. When the sun rose, I made a decision. "I'm going to walk the false trail," I said. "The one that leads to the rim." "That's insane. You saw what happened to my duplicate." "Your duplicate fell off, but maybe that's how you break the loop. Maybe that's the way out. Or maybe it's the way to become a permanent part of the loop, a ghost hammering stakes for eternity. I have to try something, Eli. We can't just sit here waiting for whatever this is to decide what happens to us." He studied my face for a long moment. "If you're going, I'm going with you." "No. Someone needs to stay here, document what happens. If you don't come back, I'm trapped here alone, so I'm coming with you." There was no point arguing. We packed light, just water, first aid supplies, and our radios in case they somehow started working. We left the tents and most of our gear. If this worked, we could come back for it later. If it didn't work, well, we wouldn't need it anyway. We found the false trail easily. The markers were exactly where I'd seen them the previous morning. Bright orange blazes pointing toward the canyon rim. I took point, following the line of markers through increasingly rough terrain. The false trail was steep, the footing treacherous with loose scree and exposed rock. We had to scramble in places using our hands as much as our feet, but the markers continued, each one visible from the previous one, guiding us steadily upward and outward toward the rim. After maybe 40 minutes of climbing, we reached a flat area about 30 feet from the canyon's edge, and there, sitting on a boulder in the middle of the clearing, was another Morgan. She, I, looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes, uniform dirty and torn, hands scraped and bleeding. She was holding a paintbrush and a can of orange paint, and as we watched, she stood up, walked to a nearby tree and carefully painted a blaze. Her technique was perfect, exactly matching the others we'd been following. Then she dropped the brush, turned, and walked toward the rim. "Morgan, stop!" I shouted. She didn't stop. She didn't even pause. She walked right up to the edge and kept going, her body disappearing over the side without a sound. Eli grabbed my arm. "Don't look, don't watch." But I had to look, I had to see. We approached the edge carefully and peered down into the canyon. The duplicate Morgan wasn't there. No body on the rocks below, no sign of impact, nothing. Just empty air and a 1,000-foot drop. When we turned around, she was back on the boulder, holding the paintbrush, preparing to start the sequence again. "It's like a recording," Eli said. "The same actions, over and over, forever." But why? What's the point? Maybe there is no point. Maybe this is just what happens when time breaks down, when cause and effect stop working properly. Actions without purpose repeated endlessly. I watched my duplicate stand up and paint another blaze. The movements were so familiar. My own habits, my own mannerisms, captured and replayed. It was like watching myself in a mirror, except the reflection was independent, trapped in its own cycle. "We need to break the pattern," I said. "Interrupt the loop somehow." How? I thought about it. The duplicates were performing specific tasks, Eli installing markers, me painting blazes, and when those tasks reached a certain point, the duplicates would walk to the rim and fall. Then the sequence would reset. What if we prevented the task from completing? What if we removed the markers as fast as the duplicates could install them? Painted over the blazes as fast as they could create them? "We interfere," I said. "We stop them from finishing their work." We spent the next hour doing exactly that. Every time duplicate Morgan painted a blaze, I painted over it. Every time duplicate Eli appeared and tried to install a stake, real Eli pulled it back out. The duplicates didn't react to our interference. They just kept trying to complete their tasks over and over, unable to adapt or respond to obstacles. But nothing changed. The loop continued, the duplicates continued, and our GPS unit still showed 5.2 miles from the trailhead. "It's not working," Eli said, breathing hard from exertion. "We're just making ourselves part of the loop." He was right. By interfering with the duplicates, we'd essentially joined their cycles. We were now part of the pattern, adding complexity, but not breaking it. I sat down on the ground, exhausted and frustrated. The duplicate Morgan painted another blaze. The duplicate Eli hammered another stake. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and we remained trapped at 5.2 miles from a trailhead we could never reach. "There has to be a way out," I said. "People escape loops in time travel stories all the time. There's always a solution, always a trick." "This isn't a story, Morgan. This is real, and maybe there is no way out." I pulled out my GPS unit and stared at the screen. 5.2 miles. That number had become the defining feature of our reality, the one constant in a world where nothing else made sense. And then I had a thought. "What if we go to the actual 5.2-mile point?" I said. "We're at the 5.2-mile point. That's the problem." "No, I mean the real 5.2-mile point. According to the original trail markers, we're at mile 8 or beyond, but according to the GPS, we're at 5.2. What if there's a difference? What if one of those locations is the center of the loop?" I don't follow. Think about it. The trail markers disappeared ahead of my position, but they stayed intact behind me. The duplicates are all operating in this area, but not anywhere else. Maybe the loop has boundaries. and the center's at the actual 5.2-mile point. Not where the GPS thinks we are, but where we really are. Eli considered this. So you're saying we need to find the discrepancy? The place where GPS reality and actual reality diverge? Exactly. That might be where the loop originates, and if we can get there, maybe we can disrupt it at the source. It was a thin theory based on desperation and science fiction, but it was the only idea we had. We left the false trail and headed back to the main trail, then started hiking systematically backward, counting trail markers. If I'd been at mile 8 when I made camp, then the true 5.2-mile point was about 2.8 miles behind my position. We hiked carefully, counting every marker, every tenth of a mile. And as we approached what should have been the 5.2-mile mark, the canyon began to change. The change was subtle at first, a slight shimmer in the air, like heat haze, except the temperature was cool. Then the shimmer intensified and I could see through it to something else. Multiple versions of the trail existing simultaneously. In one version, the path went straight ahead. In another, it curved left. In a third, it split into 2 directions. Do you see that? I asked. Yeah, what the hell is it? The center of the loop, where all the different iterations overlap. We approached slowly, and the shimmer became more pronounced. I could see duplicate versions of ourselves walking the same path. Some ahead of us, some behind, some occupying the exact same space we were standing in. They passed through us like ghosts, unaware of our presence, each one trapped in their own version of the loop. At the exact center, where the shimmer was brightest, there was a cairn. Not an official trail marker, but a stack of rocks built by someone long ago, now covered in lichen and weathered by years of exposure. And built into the cairn, visible through a gap in the stones, was something that didn't belong. A small metal box, corroded but intact. I reached in carefully and pulled it out. The box was locked, but the metal was so degraded that the lock broke when I pulled on it. Inside was a journal, wrapped in plastic to protect it from moisture. The first page read, Survey Notes, High Ridge Trail, 1981, J. Morrison, BLM. I flipped through the pages. Most of it was routine survey data, elevations, GPS coordinates, or rather, the older pre-GPS surveying coordinates. Notes about trail conditions. Morrison had been thorough, documenting every tenth of a mile, noting changes in vegetation, marking spots where erosion might become problematic. Standard BLM survey work from an era when trail maintenance was still finding its footing in wilderness areas. But near the end, the handwriting became erratic, the notes more frantic. The careful block letters degraded into a desperate scrawl. September 23, 1981. Something wrong with this section. Compass behaves erratically. Same landmarks appearing in different locations. Need to investigate further. The cairn I built this morning to mark the 5.2-mile point. I keep finding it in places I haven't been yet. Or have I been there? Memory feels slippery here, like trying to hold water. September 24, 1981. Camped at estimated mile 5.2 next to the cairn. Bizarre phenomena during night. Heard my own voice calling from the trail, but I was in my tent. Investigated and saw myself walking toward the canyon rim. Same uniform, same pack, same everything. Tried to stop him, but he didn't respond, didn't acknowledge my presence. Watched him walk off the edge. No sound of impact. No scream. Nothing. When I went back to my tent, shaking, trying to make sense of it, I heard my footsteps on the trail again. It's happening in a loop. I'm watching myself die over and over. September 25th, 1981. Still unable to leave this location. Every direction I walk leads back to the same point. Tried following the river south, ended up at the cairn. Tried climbing up the canyon wall, ended up at the cairn. Tried bushwhacking west through terrain I know I've never crossed before. Ended up at the cairn. GPS coordinates frozen at the exact measurements I recorded for this spot. Radio not working. I have enough food for maybe 3 more days. Water isn't a problem. The seasonal creek is still running, but that doesn't matter if I can't leave. Need to document this in case someone finds my notes. If you're reading this, I'm probably already dead. Or worse, still here, still trapped, still walking the same path. September 26, 1981. Multiple versions of myself now visible. All performing the same tasks: setting up camp, checking coordinates, walking to the rim. Counted at least 7 of me this morning. We don't interact, don't acknowledge each other. Like we exist in separate films being projected onto the same screen. I think I understand now. The canyon has folded in on itself here. Time is looping, and I'm caught in it. The cairn, my cairn, the one I built to mark this survey point. It's at the center of everything. I think I made a mistake. I think I built it on top of something that was already wrong with this place, some weakness in reality that my marker somehow anchored and amplified. If anyone finds this, stay away from mile 5.2. The coordinates are a trap. Once you're here, you can't leave. September 27, 1981. Food running low. Water still fine, but I can't think about that because I keep seeing myself walk off the cliff and it's driving me insane. Tried talking to my duplicates, they don't respond. Tried destroying the cairn, couldn't make myself do it. Every time I approached it with the intention of knocking it down, my hands wouldn't cooperate. Like the loop protects itself, I'm going to try something different. Going to walk to the rim deliberately, see if that breaks the cycle. See if conscious choice makes a difference versus the mechanical repetition I've been watching. If it doesn't work, if I become just another duplicate walking the same path forever, then this journal is my final message. The loop can't be broken from inside. Don't try, just stay away. Tell my wife I'm sorry. Tell my kids their dad was trying to do his job right up until the end. J. Morrison. The journal ended there. I looked up at Eli, saw my own horror reflected in his face. He's still here, Eli said quietly. Morrison. He's still trapped in this loop, walking the same pattern for over 30 years. As if summoned by his name, a figure appeared on the trail ahead of us. An older man in a faded BLM uniform from the early 80s, holding a compass and a notebook, walking toward the canyon rim with that same blank, purposeful expression we'd seen on all the duplicates. He walked past us, through the shimmer, and disappeared over the edge. We're going to end up like him, Eli said. We're going to be stuck here forever. No, I held up the journal. He said it can't be broken from inside, but we're not inside anymore. We're at the center, where all the loops originate. Maybe we can break it from here. How? I looked at the cairn, at the shimmer surrounding it, at the multiple versions of reality layered on top of each other. The cairn was the marker, the anchor point that had somehow created or captured this temporal anomaly. Morrison had built it during his survey work, not knowing that this particular spot was where time and space were already weak, already prone to folding in on themselves. We destroy the marker, I said. We take it apart, scatter the stones, disrupt whatever is anchoring the loop to this location. That's insane. What if it makes things worse? What if it doesn't? Morrison said he couldn't make himself destroy it, like the loop protected itself. But we're not Morrison. We're not the ones who built it. Maybe we can do what he couldn't. Eli stared at the cairn for a long moment. Through the shimmer, I could see Morrison's duplicate approaching again, compass in hand, preparing for another walk to the rim. How many times had he made that walk? How many thousands of times over 32 years? "Fuck it," Eli said finally. "Let's try." We attacked the cairn with everything we had. The stones were heavy, wedged tight after decades of settling. My hands scraped against lichen-covered granite as I pulled, and I felt resistance. Not physical resistance, but something deeper. A pressure in my mind, making it hard to focus, hard to remember why I was doing this. Images flashed through my head. Me walking away from the cairn, me deciding this was a bad idea, me hiking back to the trailhead and leaving the loop intact. The thoughts felt like they were coming from outside, like something was trying to convince me to stop. "Keep going," Eli shouted, though his voice sounded distant, muffled. "Don't listen to it." I pulled harder. A large stone came free, nearly hitting my foot as it fell. The shimmer pulsed, intensified. I could see multiple versions of myself now. Morgan pulling stones. Morgan walking away. Morgan standing frozen and unable to move. All the possible choices, all the potential futures, existing simultaneously. Another stone, another. Eli was working on the opposite side, his face set with determination even as sweat poured down his temples. The cairn was maybe 3 feet tall now, shrinking as we dismantled Morrison's survey marker stone by stone. The pressure in my mind increased. I could feel the loop trying to reset me, trying to pull me into a pattern. Walk away from the cairn, return to my tent, start the sequence again. My legs wanted to move in that direction. My hands wanted to stop pulling stones. "No," I said out loud. "Not happening." The cairn was down to 2 feet, 18 inches, 1 foot. Just a small pile of rocks now, no longer a marker, no longer an anchor for anything. One final stone. The base. The first one Morrison had placed in 1981. The foundation of everything that came after. I grabbed it with both hands and pulled. It didn't want to move. The stone was maybe 30 pounds, not particularly large, but it felt like it weighed 1,000. The pressure in my mind became a roar, and through the shimmer I saw Morrison's duplicate stop mid-stride. For the first time since we'd been watching him, he turned and looked directly at us. His eyes were hollow, empty, like looking into a void that had once contained a person. "Help me!" I shouted to Eli. He grabbed the stone from the other side. Together, we pulled. The stone shifted, scraped against the ground, and finally came free. The world screamed. I don't know how else to describe it. The shimmer didn't just vanish, it shattered, breaking apart like glass, and each fragment carried a sound. Hundreds of voices, all of them Morrison's, all of them screaming at once. The duplicates became visible all around us. Morrison checking his compass. Morrison walking to the rim. Morrison writing in his journal. Morrison building the cairn for the first time. All of them overlapping. All of them crying out. And then silence. Complete, absolute silence. The world snapped back into focus with an almost physical sensation, like my ears popping. The duplicate versions of ourselves disappeared. The overlapping trails merged into one. The sounds of the canyon, birds, wind, the distant river, all rushed back in, as if someone had unmuted the world. I pulled out my GPS unit. It was updating. 5.3 miles, 5.4 miles, 5.5 miles. "It's working," Eli said, his voice shaking. "We're moving again." We ran. We didn't stop to gather our gear, didn't pause to rest, just ran down that trail as fast as our legs could carry us. The markers flew past. Mile 5, mile 4, mile 3. My GPS kept updating, confirming that we were actually moving, actually covering distance. We burst out of the trailhead at Temperance Creek just as the sun was setting, both of us gasping for air, barely able to believe we'd made it out. My truck was still there, exactly where I'd left it 3 days ago. Eli's truck was parked next to it, though he swore he'd hiked in from a different trailhead. But we didn't care about the inconsistencies anymore. We just wanted to get away from Hell's Canyon, away from the High Ridge Trail, away from mile 5.2. We sat in my truck for maybe 20 minutes, doors locked, engine running, just breathing. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say? We'd just escaped a temporal loop that had held a man captive for 32 years. We'd destroyed something we didn't fully understand, broken a pattern that might have existed long before Morrison ever built his cairn. And we had no idea if we'd actually freed him, or if we'd just sealed him inside permanently. "We should check," Eli finally said, his voice hoarse. "Check what?" "Morrison, if he's still alive, if he ever made it out." He pulled out his phone, now showing full signal, normal service, everything working again, and started searching. James Morrison, BLM Ranger, 1981. I watched him scroll through results, his face illuminated by the screen's glow. The sun had fully set now, and Temperance Creek parking lot was completely dark except for our headlights and the dim interior light of the cab. "Here," Eli said, turning the phone toward me. "Missing person case. James Morrison, age 34, BLM Ranger, disappeared September 23, 1981, while conducting trail survey work in Hell's Canyon. Last known location, High Ridge Trail, approximately mile 5.2. Extensive search conducted, no trace found. Case remains open. Presumed dead?" I asked. "Doesn't say, just says missing." He scrolled further. "Wait, there's more. An update from 95. Widow petitioned to have him declared legally dead so she could access his pension. Petition granted. There's an obituary survived by wife Patricia and 3 children. Can you find the wife?" The words came out before I could stop them. "Patricia Morrison. See if she's still alive." Eli gave me a strange look. "Why?" "Because someone should tell her. Someone should let her know what happened to her husband. Morgan, we can't tell her the truth. She'd think we were insane. Then we tell her something else. We tell her we found his survey notes. We tell her he was doing his job right up until the end. We tell her," my voice cracked, "we tell her he thought about her and his kids. Because he did, Eli. That was in his journal, his last entry. He wanted them to know." Eli was quiet for a long moment. Then he went back to searching. "Patricia Morrison, maiden name Clifton, born 1946. Looks like she remarried in 98, became Patricia Hendricks. Still living in Boise. Has a Facebook page even. Her profile says she's retired, does volunteer work at the library. Does it list her kids? 2 daughters and a son, Michelle, Karen, and James Jr. He kept scrolling. James Jr. works for the Forest Service, based in McCall. Apparently decided to follow in his dad's footsteps. The weight of that hit me hard. A son who'd never known his father, who'd grown up with nothing but questions and a missing person file, and who'd still chosen the same career, who'd still gone into wilderness management, maybe hoping to understand what had happened, or maybe just trying to feel close to a father who'd vanished when he was probably still in elementary school. "We have to talk to them," I said. "Morgan, I'm not asking. I'm going, with or without you." We drove straight to Pittsburgh Landing and filed our basic reports. The sanitized versions that mentioned GPS malfunctions and communication problems but nothing about loops or duplicates or journals from 1981. Then we drove to Boise. It was past midnight when we reached the city, too late to knock on anyone's door. We got a motel room, 2 beds, both of us too wired to sleep but too exhausted to do anything else. I lay in the dark with Morrison's journal on the nightstand next to me, still wrapped in its protective plastic, and thought about his last words to his family. In the morning, we found Patricia Hendrick's address. She lived in a modest house in the North End, with a well-maintained garden and a bird feeder in the front yard. We sat in the truck across the street for 10 minutes, trying to figure out what we were going to say. "Let me do the talking," Eli finally said. "You're too emotionally invested in this. His journal is addressed to her. She has a right to read it. And if reading it makes things worse, if it brings back all that grief, then at least she'll know," I said. "At least she'll have answers." We walked up to the door and knocked. A woman in her 60s answered, gray hair, kind eyes, wearing a cardigan despite the warm October morning. She looked at our BLM uniforms with curiosity but no fear. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Mrs. Hendricks?" I said. "My name is Morgan Shadley, and this is Eli Torrance. We're rangers with the Bureau of Land Management. We were hoping we could talk to you about your first husband, James Morrison." Her expression changed instantly. Not to grief, exactly, but to a kind of wary sadness, like we'd touched an old wound that had never quite healed. "What about him?" "We found something while conducting trail maintenance on the High Ridge Trail. Some of his survey notes. We thought you might want them." She invited us inside, made coffee we didn't drink, and sat across from us in her living room while I pulled out the journal and explained, carefully, vaguely, where we'd found it. I told her it had been protected from the elements, that it contained detailed survey work and personal notes, that the last entry mentioned her and the children. "May I see it?" she asked quietly. I handed it over. She opened it with shaking hands, flipped past the survey data to the final entries. I watched her face as she read, saw tears gathering in her eyes. When she reached the last page, the last lines where Morrison said goodbye to her and asked her to tell the kids he'd been trying to do his job right up until the end, she closed the journal and held it against her chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "All these years, I wondered if he'd been scared, if he'd suffered. If he'd thought about us at all, now I know. He thought about you a lot," I said. "That comes through clearly in his notes." She wiped her eyes and looked at both of us. "Can you tell me what really happened? Not the official story. I read those reports back in 1981. All the speculation about falls or animal attacks or getting lost. I want to know what you really think happened to my husband." Eli and I exchanged glances. Then I said, "I think he found something on that trail that shouldn't exist. Some kind of anomaly in the canyon, something that trapped him. And I think he tried very hard to get back to you, but he couldn't. Not because he didn't want to, but because it was impossible." It wasn't the whole truth, but it was true enough. Patricia nodded slowly, like this confirmed something she'd always suspected. "He used to tell me that Hell's Canyon was older than we could understand. That there were places down there where the rules were different. I thought he was just being poetic." She clutched the journal tighter. "Will you do something for me? Will you tell his son about this? James Jr. He works for the Forest Service now. He should know his father's last thoughts." "We will," I promised. We left her house an hour later, after she'd had time to read through the entire journal and ask questions we answered as honestly as we could without mentioning time loops or duplicates, or the fact that her husband might still be trapped at mile 5.2, walking the same path for eternity. As we drove away, Eli said, "Do you really think we freed him?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe destroying the cairn broke the loop, or maybe it just closed it with him still inside. Maybe every time someone walks past mile 5.2 now, there's still a version of Morrison checking his compass, building his cairn, walking to the rim. That's a cheerful thought. But at least no one else can get trapped there now. At least we stopped it from catching anyone else. You hope? Yeah, I said. I hope. Eli requested a transfer 2 weeks later. Got assigned to a flat, boring district in eastern Oregon where the worst thing that could happen was a twisted ankle or a sunburn. Last I heard, he's still there, still maintaining trails, still refusing to talk about what happened. I stayed in Hell's Canyon for another 6 months, but I never went back to the High Ridge Trail. Eventually, I requested a transfer too. Ended up doing wilderness education in Boise, teaching people how to read maps and use GPS and stay safe in the backcountry. Ironic, really, given that I no longer trust any of those things. The High Ridge Trail was closed for emergency maintenance shortly after our reports. It's been closed ever since. Officially, there are stability issues with the trail surface. Unofficially, 2 separate ranger teams reported GPS anomalies and communication problems when they tried to inspect the area. Base decided it was safer just to keep it closed. But sometimes I wonder about Jay Morrison, that BLM ranger from 1981 who walked into the loop and never came out. Is he still there, still trapped at mile 5.2, still performing his survey work for eternity? Did destroying the cairn free him, or did it just close the loop with him still inside? I don't know, and I'm afraid to go back and check. What I do know is this. Hell's Canyon has places where the rules break down, where time and space don't work the way they should. The canyon is so deep, so old, so carved by eons of water and weather that it's worn through more than just rock. It's worn through the fabric of reality itself, creating pockets where cause and effect get tangled, where past and present and future exist simultaneously. Most of the time, those pockets are harmless. Most of the time, you can hike through the canyon without ever knowing they're there. But occasionally, under the right conditions, at the right location, you might stumble into one. And if you do, if you find yourself at a place where your GPS won't update, where your position seems fixed no matter how far you walk, where you hear sounds of people working even though you're alone, get out immediately. Don't try to understand it, don't try to fix it, don't try to break the loop from inside. Just turn around, retrace your steps, and leave. Because once you're caught in the loop, every action you take becomes part of the pattern. Every step you walk gets repeated endlessly. Every decision you make echoes across time, creating duplicates that will walk those same paths forever. I got out, Eli got out, but we got lucky. We found the center of the loop, found Morrison's journal, destroyed the anchor that held everything in place. Not everyone will be that lucky. So if you're hiking in Hell's Canyon, pay attention to your GPS. If it stops updating, if the coordinates freeze, if you find yourself returning to the same landmarks no matter which direction you walk, don't waste time trying to figure out why.